The knock came before the kettle had even begun to whistle, and Evelyn Ashworth recognized it before she reached the bottom of the stairs. 3 raps, sharp and deliberate, and spaced just far enough apart to suggest that the person delivering them had done this many times before and knew precisely what effect they intended to produce. She had been hearing that knock for 3 months, and it had not become any easier to hear. She was wearing her plain gray wool dress because she had learned that dressing carefully for Mr. Grimshaw felt like a kind of defeat, as though she were making an effort on his behalf rather than her own. She kept her chin level and her hands relaxed as she crossed the hall, because she had also learned that the fastest way to give power to someone who already held most of it was to let them see you were afraid. Mrs. Pratt, their housekeeper and the last remaining member of a household staff that had once numbered 12, was already at the door. She had opened it with the careful neutrality of a woman who had made peace with the situation, but had not accepted it. Mr. Tobias Grimshaw stood on the step in his dark coat and gold-rimmed spectacles, his leather satchel against his side, his expression arranged into the professionally pleasant look he wore like a uniform. He was a small man who occupied more space than his physical frame suggested, the way certain people do when they carry authority that belongs to someone else. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth," he said, seeing her in the hall. "I hope to find you at home." "We are generally at home, Mr. Grimshaw," she said, continuing down the stairs at an unhurried pace. "It is one of the few advantages of not having many other places to be." He smiled at that, the way he always smiled at her small sharpnesses, with the amused patience of a man who understood that the kitten could not do any real damage. He stepped inside without being fully invited, because that was technically within his rights under the terms of the agreements, and they both knew it. Margaret Ashworth appeared within 3 minutes, which told Evelyn that her mother had heard the knock as well, and had used those 3 minutes to dress herself and arrange her expression into the particular composure she reserved for difficult encounters. She sat across from Mr. Grimshaw in the cold sitting room with the posture of a woman who had been raised to believe that how you carry yourself is the one thing no one can take from you, and who had tested that claim thoroughly over the last 4 years, and found it to be approximately true. No fire had been lit that morning. The mornings had been mild enough to justify the saving, and every small saving mattered now in a way that would have been unimaginable when Evelyn was a child, when fires were lit as a matter of course and no one counted the wood. Mr. Grimshaw opened his satchel and arranged his papers on the low table between them, with the practiced care of a man who understood that the arrangement of documents was itself a form of communication. He smoothed each one with the flat of his palm, and the gesture was both professional and faintly theatrical. "I will be direct," he said, which was how he always began, and Evelyn had noted long ago that men who announced their intention to be direct were rarely doing it as a courtesy. They were doing it as a warning. The creditors have held their position for longer than is standard. They have accepted assurances and partial correspondence, and adjusted timelines on 3 separate occasions. They are no longer prepared to do so. "What are they prepared to do?" Evelyn asked. "They require either a payment of no less than 60% of the outstanding total, or a formal legal agreement, signed and notarized, committing to full resolution." He paused. "Within 90 days. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the silence that followed. Evelyn counted 7 seconds of it. "And if 90 days pass without resolution," she said, "then the matter transfers from my desk to their solicitors, and from there the process becomes considerably more public and considerably less comfortable for everyone." He said this without cruelty and without apology, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. After he was gone, and Evelyn had closed the front door behind him herself, because she preferred to close doors personally rather than have them closed for her, she went back to the sitting room to find her mother standing at the window, looking out at the front garden. The roses Edmund Ashworth had planted there were still growing, still blooming even now in the late-season warmth, but they were entirely unmanaged, reaching in every direction, with no particular shape, beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they have been left entirely to themselves. Her father had planted them the year before she was born, in a burst of enthusiasm that was deeply characteristic of him. Edmund Ashworth had been a man of enthusiasms. He had been enthusiastic about roses, and about crop rotation theory, and about investment opportunities that had seemed genuine at the time, and about lending money to friends who had not always returned it, and about income projections that had not always come true. He had been warm and generous, and genuinely kind, and utterly impractical with money, and he had died 4 years ago at the age of 51, still believing, with complete sincerity, that things would sort themselves out. They had not sorted themselves out. They had instead arranged themselves into a situation that required Evelyn to track expenditures against income every week, and to have meetings with Mr. Grimshaw every few weeks, and to maintain, in the meantime, the appearance of a household that was managing perfectly well, because the moment it became known how serious things were, the situation would become considerably worse. Reputation was still a form of credit in this world, and she was not yet prepared to spend it. He wrote again, Margaret said, still looking at the garden. Who did? Lord Pemberley. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She had given Lord Pemberley her answer in the spring, in clear and courteous language, and the fact that he was still writing meant he had not received the answer she intended, or he had received it, and was hoping that 90 days of financial pressure would cause her to revise it. He is patient, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that Evelyn recognized as the sound of a person making an argument they do not entirely want to make. She was offering it because the situation demanded it, not because she believed in it. He is 63 years old, Evelyn said, and he has buried 2 wives, and he looks at me as though I am a piece of furniture he is considering purchasing. She said it without heat and without drama, the way she said things she had already decided about. I have given him my answer. It does not change. Margaret turned from the window. She looked at her daughter with the particular expression she wore when she was measuring the distance between what she wanted to say and what she had decided to say, and choosing the shorter route. Then what do we do? She asked, not unkindly. We think, Evelyn said, and we find another way. It was at precisely this moment that Mrs. Pratt appeared in the doorway, carrying the silver tray, and on it a single cream-colored envelope, sealed with dark blue wax. The tray was one of the last genuinely fine objects in the house. Margaret had refused to sell it on the grounds that some things were worth more as symbols of dignity than as currency, and Evelyn had not argued, because she understood that her mother needed to be right about at least a few things. Evelyn took the envelope, turned it over, and saw the single embossed word on the back flap. Ravensmore. She opened it carefully and read the card inside. Then she read it again. It was an invitation to the midsummer ball at Ravensmore Hall, hosted by His Grace, Alexander Vane, Duke of Ravensmore, 3 weeks from the following Saturday. Formal dress, a reply expected within the week. She handed it to her mother. What happened to Margaret Ashworth in the next 30 seconds was remarkable to observe. She took the card and read it, and every line of tension and careful management left her face. What replaced it was not quite joy and not quite relief, but something older than both. It was the look of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just caught a glimpse of a surface where she might be able to set it down. Ravensmore, she said softly. Yes, Evelyn said. Do you understand what this is? It means someone put our name on a guest list, Evelyn said. It means considerably more than that. Margaret set the card on the mantelpiece with the reverence she might have given a document of legal importance. Alexander Vane hosts one event each year, one, and he does not fill the guest list carelessly. We have been specifically included. It may be courtesy, Evelyn said, because someone had to say it. Father was well known to his father. It may be a gesture of respect for his memory, nothing more. It may be, Margaret agreed, or it may be something else. Either way, we are going. Evelyn looked at the card on the mantelpiece. She looked at her mother's face. She thought about Mr. Grimshaw and his stack of papers, and the clock counting 7 seconds of silence. She thought about her father planting the roses outside with great feeling and not quite enough foresight, and how they had kept growing anyway, wild and uncontrolled and alive. She thought about Clara Whitmore, who had told her once that the mistake people in difficult circumstances made most reliably was not the circumstances themselves, but the paralysis the circumstances created. You had to keep moving. You had to put one foot forward even when you could not see clearly what was ahead. All right, she said. Her mother looked at her. All right, she said again, more quietly. We will go, on my terms. I go to be present and to represent this family with what dignity we have left. I do not go to perform for anyone or to place myself at anyone's mercy. Whatever the evening produces, it produces honestly or not at all. Of course, Margaret said. She was already thinking ahead. Your cream dress, she said, with the lace from the evening jacket repurposed. And the shoes need the cobbler. The left heel has been uneven since spring. Evelyn nodded. She picked up the invitation card and read it one final time. The paper was thick and deliberate. Someone had taken care with this card, which meant the invitation behind it had not been careless. She put the card back on the mantelpiece and went upstairs to find the cream dress and see what 3 seasons had done to it. That evening she wrote to Clara Whitmore, 3 pages in close script that was long for Evelyn, who tended toward brevity. She told Clara everything, from Mr. Grimshaw and the 90 days, to the invitation, and her mother's reaction, and her own agreement to go. She told her because Clara was the person she trusted most to give her information without dressing it in what she wanted to hear. Clara's reply came the following morning, in 7 pages of dense, enthusiastic handwriting. Her cousin had attended the previous year's midsummer ball, and had returned from it with the detailed account of a careful observer. Alexander Vane was 32. He had inherited at 26, and managed the transition with a composure that people found either impressive or unsettling, depending on their temperament. He listened more than he spoke. He danced selectively. He was not interested in performing warmth he did not feel, and he had even less interest in people who performed for him. He had the previous year declined every engineered introduction, with a politeness so complete and final that no one involved could identify the exact moment it had happened. He had one close friend in the visible social world, a man named George Hendley, who everyone described as considerably more relaxed, which Clara's cousin said was not saying much in absolute terms, but was at least something. He had an aunt, Lady Florence Vane, who said whatever she thought, and who the Duke appeared to find genuinely amusing rather than exhausting, which suggested he valued directness more than he valued comfort. Evelyn read all of this twice. She folded the letter and put it in the top right drawer of her father's writing desk, next to the faint ghost of the tobacco he had kept there, and she sat with the quiet of the house around her for a while. She was 24 years old, and she had been managing a crisis for 4 years, and she was very good at it. What she was considerably less good at was allowing herself to wonder whether something might happen that was not a crisis to be managed, something that simply arrived and was good. She noticed, sitting at the desk in the evening stillness, that she was curious about something for the first time in a long time. She closed the drawer, straightened her back, and went to find Mrs. Pratt about the shoes. She spent the next few days doing what she always did when something had shifted but not yet settled, which was to work harder at the things that were already in front of her, and to let the new thing exist in the background of her attention, without forcing it into the foreground before she was ready. The accounts needed a letter sent to a solicitor in London who had been pursuing one of the smaller debts with a persistence that was becoming inconvenient. She wrote it on the Thursday morning, 3 days after the invitation arrived, and she wrote it in the careful language she had developed for this kind of correspondence, the language that was firm, without being aggressive, that conveyed management of the situation, without specifying exactly how the situation was being managed. She was good at this. She had become good at it through necessity, which was the most reliable way to become good at anything. She also wrote to Lord Pemberley. This letter was different in tone, short and clear and final, saying the things she had already said in the spring, but saying them again because he had not heard them the first time, and she was not going to leave any space for misunderstanding. She was grateful for his interest. She was certain of her answer. She wished him well in finding a suitable match elsewhere, and she said it with the genuine kindness she could apply to things she found disagreeable when they deserved kindness rather than unkindness. She sealed both letters and gave them to Mrs. Pratt for the post, and sat at the desk for a while afterward, in the quiet of the afternoon. 90 days. She turned the number over in her mind, the way she had been turning it over since Mr. Grimshaw's visit. 90 days was a specific and not very large amount of time, and she had not yet found the answer to what would happen at the end of it. But she had learned, over 4 years, that looking too far into a problem before you had the information to resolve it was a form of wasted effort. You could plan to the edge of what you knew. Beyond that, you did what was available to you now, and you trusted that the next thing would become visible when you were close enough to see it. The invitation was available to her now. The ball was 3 weeks away. She was going to trust the next thing. The dress survived 3 weeks of alteration and considerable anxiety, which was more than Evelyn had expected of it. Clara Whitmore arrived on the Monday of the second week, traveling the 3 miles from her family home, in a small hired carriage that she climbed out of, with the energy of someone who had been waiting for a specific task, and was now prepared to perform it, with considerable enthusiasm. She arrived carrying a basket that held 2 spools of cream-colored thread, a paper of pins, a set of dressmaker's shears considerably sharper than anything the Ashworth household currently possessed, and 2 small oranges wrapped in cloth. The oranges, she said, were for Evelyn, because Evelyn did not eat enough when she was anxious, and Clara had decided to address this proactively, rather than waiting to observe the consequences. "You look tired," Clara said, setting her basket on the table in the small upstairs sewing room. "I am tired," Evelyn said. "You also look like someone who has been running numbers in her head instead of sleeping." "That is accurate." Clara turned to look at her directly. She was a small woman, with brown hair, and bright dark eyes, and a face arranged for seeing things clearly, rather than for decorative purposes, which was one of the things Evelyn most valued about her. "When did you last eat a full meal?" she asked. "Recently," Evelyn said, which was not quite the truth. Clara handed her one of the oranges. "Eat that," she said. "Then we are going to look at this dress, and we are going to make it work, and you are not going to tell me once that it is hopeless, because it is not hopeless." The dress was not hopeless. It was cream silk that had once belonged to Evelyn's grandmother, stored carefully in a chest in the back of the upstairs wardrobe, and while the original design was somewhat dated, the silk itself was genuinely beautiful, the kind of material produced when quality was not considered optional. Clara looked at it in the window light for several minutes without speaking, turning it, examining the seams. "The lace comes off," she said finally. "It is too old-fashioned. We replace it with this ribbon." She produced a length from her basket. "Simpler, cleaner. The sleeves can come in here, and the waist needs adjustment, but that is nothing." "Can you do all of that?" Evelyn asked. "I have 2 weeks and considerable motivation," Clara said. "Yes." They worked for 3 days. Clara came each morning, and they spread the dress across the table and worked methodically, unpicking and restitching and pressing, and while they worked they talked. They talked about everything, the way women talk when their hands are occupied and their minds are free. About the house and the finances and what Evelyn had managed so far and what remained to be managed. About the Duke of Ravensmore and what Clara had found in her cousin's account, and what it might or might not mean that the invitation had come. "He sounds like someone who is very good at keeping people at a distance," Clara said, threading a needle with surgical precision. "Many people in his position are," Evelyn said. "Yes, but for different reasons. Some do it from pride, some from grief. Some from the simple fact that they cannot find anyone worth talking to, which is rarer, but it exists, and those people are usually the most interesting once you find the right conversation." "You are constructing a theory about a man you have never met," Evelyn said. "That is how theories work," Clara said serenely. "You construct them before you meet the subject, and adjust them afterward." Evelyn found herself smiling, and it was the first smile in several weeks that did not require any particular effort, which made it feel different from the others. The shoes came back from the cobbler on the Thursday of the 3rd week, resoled and with the heel corrected, and Mrs. Pratt had polished them until they did not look like shoes that had been resoled twice, which Evelyn considered a small but real achievement. Margaret had located white gloves in excellent condition in a drawer that had not been opened in some time. Combined with the altered dress, the borrowed ribbon, and the second-best pearl earrings that had survived the general dispersal of jewelry over the past 4 years, the result was more than Evelyn had expected. She stood in front of the mirror the evening before the ball and looked at the result with the clear-eyed assessment she applied to most things. The dress was good. Clara had done something with it that transformed it from an outdated relic into something classic and purposeful. The cream was right against her dark hair. The fit was precise. She did not look like someone in financial difficulty. She looked like someone who had chosen to dress simply, rather than being compelled to. There was a difference, she had discovered, between appearing impoverished and appearing unconcerned with extravagance, and the difference was largely a matter of posture and the steadiness of one's gaze. She went to bed at 10 and did not sleep until past midnight. When she did sleep, she woke before 6, with the feeling of someone who has been thinking through a problem, even in the hours that belonged to rest. She lay still for a few minutes in the gray morning light, listening to the house wake around her. and reminded herself of what she had agreed to, and what she had not agreed to, and what the difference between those two things was going to mean for the day ahead. Clara arrived at 4 to help them dress, and to provide what she called moral support, which was Clara's way of describing the service, of saying calm, reasonable things to people who were not feeling particularly calm or reasonable. She arranged Evelyn's hair with the skill of decades of practice, pinning it simply, but with precision, leaving a few pieces free, in a way that appeared deliberate rather than careless. "How do you feel?" Clara asked, looking at her in the mirror. "Prepared," Evelyn said. "That is an excellent answer, and also not what I asked." Evelyn met her eyes in the mirror. "I feel like someone about to walk into a situation she cannot fully control, and making peace with that fact." "That is a much more honest answer," Clara said, and pinned the last piece of hair. "Good." The carriage arrived at 7:30. It was hired, plain and presentable, which was what Evelyn had requested, because impressing people on the journey was not the goal, and also cost more money. Margaret had not argued. She had learned, over the years, which negotiations with Evelyn were worth engaging. They drove for 40 minutes through the evening, through the rolling green landscape that Evelyn had known all her life. The light was long at that hour, the kind of light that turns ordinary things into something worth looking at, and she watched it through the window and kept her breathing even, and thought about what she was going to do when they arrived, which was simply be present and be herself and see what that produced. Ravensmoor Hall appeared when they came around the bend in the road, and Evelyn understood immediately why people who had seen it tended to remember it. It was large in the way that certain buildings are large, not merely in size but in the space it occupied in the mind, somehow more present than its physical dimensions suggested. It sat at the end of a long drive, flanked by old trees, and it was lit from within and without, with what seemed like an impossible number of lamps, warm gold against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Margaret said nothing for a full 20 seconds, which told Evelyn that the sight had exceeded her expectations, because Margaret always had something to say. They joined the queue of carriages moving up the drive, and Evelyn watched the people descending before them, gowned and gloved and arranged with the elaborate ease of people who had been doing this all their lives. She adjusted her gloves and straightened her back, and reminded herself that she had every right to be here, that the invitation had been genuine, and that what she wore, or what her family owed, had nothing to do with whether she was worth speaking to. They were announced at the entrance by a man in formal dress who repeated their names to the room in a clear, carrying voice. Evelyn walked through the entrance and into the ballroom, and stopped breathing for just a moment, not from nerves, but from the sheer physical reality of the space. It was enormous, and perfectly lit, the ceiling high enough to belong to a different building than the floor, the music already filling every corner, a warm and elegant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The room was half full, and the people in it were in motion or conversation, a sea of color and sound, and warmth that she had not been part of in a very long time. She located the exits first, because that was what she always did. Then the refreshment table. Then the quieter spaces near the walls where someone who needed a moment could stand without being observed, to be standing there on purpose. Then she saw him. She did not know who he was in that first moment. She only noticed him because he was standing still, in a room full of movement. And stillness in a crowded ballroom has a particular quality of authority that is impossible to manufacture. He was tall, dark-haired, listening to something the shorter man beside him was saying, with his attention fully on that person, and not scanning the room the way most men in his position would scan the room to manage their social obligations. He was not performing attention. He was simply paying it. Their eyes met, briefly, across the space between them, the way eyes sometimes meet in a crowded room, simply because two people happen to look in the same direction at the same moment. He looked at her, with the same quality of attention he had been directing at his companion, unhurried, uncalculated, simply present. Then someone spoke to him from his other side, and his attention shifted, and Evelyn turned away and took a glass from a passing tray and drank from it, and reminded herself that she had come here to be present and observant, and to give nothing away that she had not consciously chosen to give. She had not chosen what she was currently feeling, which was the faint and inconvenient beginning of something she could not yet name. She set it aside carefully, the way you set down something fragile when you need both hands for something else. Margaret appeared at her elbow with the contained delight of a woman who had managed to channel her excitement into something resembling social composure. "Lady Petworth is looking over here," she said. "Shall we go and say hello?" "Yes," Evelyn said. She followed her mother into the room, and the evening began. The 3 weeks between the invitation and the ball had their own particular rhythm, and Evelyn found herself moving through them differently from how she moved through ordinary weeks. Ordinarily, a week was a series of problems arranged in chronological order. There was the account ledger that needed weekly attention, and the correspondence with Mr. Grimshaw's office that had to be managed carefully, worded to convey progress without specifying where the progress was coming from, and the household budget that she adjusted every Sunday evening at the desk with a cup of cold tea, and the systematic patience of someone who had learned to find small economies without appearing to have found them. There were the letters she wrote to the creditors on Margaret's behalf, because Margaret's letters tended toward the eloquent and the emotional, and Evelyn's tended toward the precise and the factual, and precision was more useful in this context than eloquence. Ordinarily, a week was a management exercise. The 3 weeks before the ball were something different. She caught herself doing things she did not normally do. She caught herself reading Clara's letter about the Duke a second time, not for information she had missed the first time, but because she was turning certain phrases over in her mind, the way you turn a stone to see what is on the underside. She caught herself looking at the cream dress that Clara had altered, and thinking about it when she had no practical reason to be thinking about it. She caught herself calculating, not the financial calculations that occupied most of her mental space, but other calculations, the kind that involved probability and outcome, and the difference between what was likely and what was possible. She did not care for these calculations. They were imprecise, and the variables were unknown, and she could not trust the results. She filed them away and went back to the ledger. But they came back. The night before the ball, after Margaret had gone to bed and Mrs. Pratt had turned out the kitchen lamps and the house had settled into the specific quiet of late evening, Evelyn sat at her father's desk and made herself think clearly. She pulled out the sheet of paper she kept for this purpose, the one where she had written what we need and what we have and what might close the gap, and she looked at it. The third column was still largely empty. The invitation to the ball had not filled it in. A conversation at a ball could not fill it in. Nothing about one evening in one room full of people could address, in any direct way, the financial situation that Mr. Grimshaw had described with such professional pleasantness. She knew this. She also knew that the problem had never been a shortage of facts. She had more than enough facts. What she had been lacking, for 4 years, was forward movement, something different from the grinding management of decline. The invitation was not a solution, but it was movement. It was one foot placed in front of the other, in a direction she had not been going before. She put the paper away and went to bed, and lay in the dark thinking about movement and possibility, and a Duke who listened to people rather than performing listening, and eventually she slept. The morning of the ball she woke feeling something she could not immediately name. She lay still for a moment, considering it. It was not excitement, exactly. Excitement was for people who had not been managing a crisis for 4 years, and who still had the capacity for uncomplicated feeling. What she felt was something older and more durable than excitement. It was readiness. She was ready to go and see what happened, and that was more than she had felt about anything in a considerable time. She ate breakfast properly, every bite, because Mrs. Pratt had made it with the particular care she reserved for occasions she had decided were significant, and because Evelyn had learned that not eating enough was a mistake she could not afford to keep making. She dressed carefully and let Clara arrange her hair, and she stood in front of the mirror and looked at the result with the clear-eyed honesty she applied to everything. She looked like herself, dressed for something that mattered. That was, she thought, exactly right. By 9 o'clock the ballroom was full, and the heat had become a presence in its own right. It gathered near the ceiling first, drawn upward by the candles in every chandelier and sconce, and then it worked its way down through the crowd as the room filled, the accumulated warmth of several hundred people in formal dress, in a space that had not been designed for ventilation, so much as for grandeur. Evelyn could feel it pressing against the back of her neck, along the collar of her dress, across the tops of her gloved hands. She had been warm for an hour, and had been managing it the way she managed most inconveniences, which was to file it away as something to be addressed later, and continue doing whatever needed to be done now. She had danced twice, Once with Lord Alderton, who was pleasant, but clearly distracted, managing the obligation of a dance with someone he had been introduced to without particularly wanting to be introduced to. And once with Lord Edmund Firth, who was attentive in a way that felt organized, asking questions about her family and her interests, with the focused care of someone confirming information he had already gathered. He was not unpleasant. He was simply obvious about his intentions, and obvious intentions always made Evelyn slightly tired, because they required her to pretend she had not noticed them. She had eaten nothing since Mrs. Pratt's breakfast that morning. There had been small things offered at 9, carried on trays through the room, but she had been in a conversation when they came round, and then they did not come round again, and she had told herself she would reach the refreshment table soon, and had not yet managed it. She was standing near the long windows on the eastern side of the room, when she noticed that the glass was cooler than the air around it, and moved a half-step closer to it, because cool was preferable to warm, and this was the most cooling available. That was when a man stopped beside her. He said, with no preamble of any social kind, "The glass at this end of the room is warmer than the glass at the other end," which suggests those windows were opened earlier, and these were not. I have been trying to determine whether opening one now would be appropriate or whether someone had a reason for leaving them closed. She turned to look at him, and it took her a moment to place him, because she had not been watching for him specifically, and her attention had been on the conversation she had just finished. When she placed him, she felt a small, quiet recognition, not the dramatic sort, but the ordinary kind, the sense of something peripheral moving into the foreground. He was the man she had seen when she first walked in, the one who had been standing still in the moving room. Up close he was different from the assembled composite she had built from descriptions and second-hand accounts, or rather the descriptions had been accurate, but descriptions always missed the quality of a presence, the specific way a person occupied a space. He had gray eyes, and an expression that was neither warm nor cold in that specific moment, but was entirely present, paying the same unhurried attention to her that she had observed him paying to his companion earlier. "If the windows were closed intentionally," she said, "it was an error. It is extremely warm in here." "It is," he agreed. "You look as though you have been noticing it." "I notice most things," she said, and then paused, because that was not the kind of thing she usually said to strangers at parties, and she was not entirely certain why she had said it now. Perhaps it was the warmth. Perhaps it was that his tone did not carry the particular register of performance that most social conversations carried, and she had responded without thinking. He seemed neither surprised nor made uncomfortable by what she had said. She considered whether to give him the polite version or the actual version. She gave him the actual version, partly because something in his manner suggested the polite version would be noticed for what it was, and partly because the warmth and the long evening had slightly loosened her usual calculation. "The music is being played faster than the notation requires," she said. "The lead musician is almost certainly warm as well. The woman in the blue dress near the east entrance has been avoiding the man in the gray coat for the better part of 2 hours, and is running out of room to maneuver. And whoever arranged the flowers did it with great technical skill, and very little joy, because they are perfectly symmetrical, in a way that flowers are not in the wild, and symmetry produced under pressure always reads as anxiety rather than care." He was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. It was not a large smile, and it did not last long, but it was entirely genuine, and it changed the quality of his face in a way she had not expected. "The musician is almost certainly warm," he said. "I had not observed the couple near the entrance, but I intend to look. And the flowers," he glanced toward the nearest arrangement. "You are right. There is something unhappy about them. They will be better in the morning," she said, "when they relax." He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. "That is a very generous thing to say about arranged flowers. I have spent some time watching things that were constrained by circumstance become more themselves when the circumstance changed," she said, and heard herself, and felt the faint warmth of having said something more personal than she intended. "That is a strange thing to say at a party." "Most interesting things are," he said, simply. They stood in the small silence that followed, and it was not uncomfortable, which was unusual. Silences with new acquaintances always carried social pressure, the sense that something needed to be said quickly before the empty space became an admission of failure. This silence was different. It simply existed between them, like a breath between sentences, asking nothing of either of them. She was about to say something. She was not certain what, only that the conversation had opened a door she had not expected, and she was curious what was behind it. And curiosity was something she had not felt in quite this specific way in a long time. Then the warmth hit her differently. It had been present all evening, managed and filed away, and in this particular moment, it stopped being something she could file. It came in a wave, not sharp but comprehensive, a heaviness behind her eyes, and a lightness in her legs, that were directly contradictory, and both completely real. The edges of the room shifted in the particular way that edges shift when the body is quietly redirecting all available resources toward an emerging problem. She took one careful breath, then another. She put one hand against the window frame because the glass was cool, and the glass was real, and she needed something real. She heard the music continue, and the room continue, and every conversation around her continue, and she was separated from all of it by a membrane that was growing thinner by the second. She thought with complete clarity, "This is going to be embarrassing." And then the room tilted, and her hand came away from the window frame, and she had exactly one moment of awareness before she found herself caught. Not by the floor, not by the wall, by arms, by a specific steady weight and warmth that was different from the ambient heat of the room, more immediate and more solid, and she registered through the fog that whoever it was had moved very quickly for someone who had not appeared to be watching for anything. She heard the intake of breath from the people nearest them. She heard the ripple of sound move outward from the point of incident, the way sound moves in a room when something has happened that everyone immediately wants to discuss. She heard someone say her name from a direction she could not determine. What she was most aware of was that she was being held by someone who had not hesitated for a single moment and whose hold was entirely secure, not the uncertain grab of someone reacting to surprise, but the immediate competence of someone who had assessed the situation in less than a second and responded to it. She heard, very close, a voice she recognized. "Stay still," he said. "You are all right." His voice was exactly as it had been during their conversation, direct, unhurried, carrying no performance of concern but conveying it nonetheless. She had not yet managed to open her eyes, but she was. She realized with the detached clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of disasters, completely certain she was not going to fall. Whatever was holding her was not going to drop her. That certainty was an extraordinarily calming thing to feel, in the middle of what was otherwise an absolutely mortifying situation. The ballroom was making the sound of an event that has been interrupted. Music had stopped. Voices were low and urgent. Someone was asking for water. She heard the words, "The Duke," pronounced with the kind of surprise that told her the identity of the person holding her had not been immediately obvious to everyone observing. And then she heard it again from a different direction, and the shape of the situation assembled itself in her mind with the particular crispness of something you would very much prefer not to know. The man she had been talking to at the window about flowers and musicians and constrained circumstances was Alexander Vane, the Duke of Ravensmoor. She was at his ball, and she had collapsed directly into his arms. She became aware that her hands were gripping the front of his jacket, and she very carefully, with considerable effort, unclenched them one finger at a time. The room around her was doing what rooms do when something has happened that no one expected. It was not silent. Ballrooms are never silent, and even an event of this kind cannot produce complete silence in a space of that size. But the noise had changed quality. The music that had been playing stopped mid-phrase, which is an arresting sound, a phrase left unfinished, and the conversations that had been going in every direction pulled toward the point where something had happened, the way water pulls toward a drain. She was aware of all of this in the specific, detached clarity that sometimes comes when the body is in a crisis and the mind retreats to the position of observer. She was aware of the warmth of the arms holding her and the coolness of the floor she had not yet reached, and the sound of someone nearby saying something about a chair, and she was aware, with a clarity that she found faintly absurd, that she was still thinking about the flowers. She had just thought of something she wanted to say about the flowers. It was not an important thing. It was the kind of small, specific observation that had been going between them in the conversation at the window, the kind of exchange she had not had in a social setting in so long, that the freshness of it was what she noticed most about it. She wanted to finish the sentence. She could not finish the sentence, because the sentence had, temporarily, left her. "Stay still," said the voice. "You are all right." She was aware that she was not currently all right in the technical sense, that the position she was in was not one she would have chosen under any other circumstances, that the entire room was observing this, and would go home and describe it over breakfast, and she would be the central event of the story for days. She was aware of all of this, and set all of it aside, because the voice had said she was all right, and the voice was precise about things, and she had the specific, quiet certainty that something precise would not say she was all right, if she was not. She unclenched her hands slowly, one finger at a time. The lapels of his jacket released beneath her fingers, and she became aware that she had been holding on, with a grip that communicated more than she would have liked it to. She heard her name spoken somewhere behind her, in Margaret's voice, but in the register Margaret used only in private. The register below, the composed and careful voice she maintained for the world. She heard it once, and then again, and then the sound of feet moving quickly across the floor. She took a breath. The breath went all the way down, which was the first breath in quite some time that had managed that. The dress that had been fitting precisely all evening still fit precisely. But she was not, she realized, fighting it the same way she had been, because the tension she had been holding in her body for the last hour had gone somewhere. There was a conversation around her that she could hear, but not fully follow. She heard words like carriage and room, and her name said several times by several different people, and she heard Alexander Vane's voice, which was steady and clear, and had not changed its quality, regardless of what was happening, saying something brief that she could not entirely catch. She heard a woman's voice, possibly his housekeeper, saying something about arrangements. She heard the music begin again, tentatively, because someone had apparently decided that the event should continue, and the sound of it resuming felt like the room making an official decision about how significant this was going to be allowed to be. She decided she did not need the room's permission to determine how significant anything was. She opened her eyes. He was looking down at her with the same unhurried attention he had been directing at the conversation about flowers and musicians, and there was something in his face that was not alarm, and was not performance of concern, but was something she thought might be the genuine article, the feeling itself, rather than the managed version of it. "I am going to stand up," she said. "Not yet," he said. "I am going to stand up," she said again, because that was what needed to happen next, regardless of what anyone thought about the timing. He made a small adjustment, shifting his hold in a way that supported rather than restricted, which she interpreted correctly, as him saying "all right" in an entirely practical way. She stood. The room tilted slightly, and then corrected, and she was standing, and she was warm, and embarrassed, and also, in some part of herself she was not going to examine right now, deeply grateful for the specific quality of the steadiness that had been available to her in the moment she needed it most. Around them, the room had pulled back slightly, giving them a small circle of space that was both considerate and observable, because people at balls are always considerate and observable simultaneously. She was aware of faces in her peripheral vision, the particular expression of people who have witnessed something, and are trying to decide what expression is appropriate to show the person it happened to. She did not look at any of them directly. She looked at the man who was still close enough to catch her again if it became necessary, and she said, quietly, "I believe I need to sit down somewhere that is not this room." "Yes," he said. "Come with me." She went. She woke to the sound of a clock she did not recognize. It ticked with a slightly different rhythm from the clock on the mantelpiece at home, a little faster, as if it belonged to a more urgent household, and Evelyn's mind registered the difference before her eyes registered anything else. For 2 full seconds, she lay completely still, listening to the unfamiliar sound, letting her mind arrange what it knew. She was lying on something soft. There was light. The air was cooler than it had been. Something had happened. It came back in a sequence, the way memories return after an interruption, each piece arriving with the specific weight of its own embarrassment. The warmth of the ballroom, the window and its cool glass, the conversation about flowers and musicians and constrained things becoming themselves, the wave of something she had tried to manage and had not quite managed in time, the arms catching her, the voice saying she was all right, with a steadiness that was not performed. She opened her eyes. The room was not large, but it was very well furnished, the kind of furnishing that communicates wealth without requiring ostentation, a restraint that was itself a form of statement. The ceiling was high and painted a soft cream. A single lamp burned on the table beside the bed, and the window was cracked slightly open, and through it came the night air, cool and clean, and carrying the faint smell of grass and something close to roses. The air was so much better than the air in the ballroom that Evelyn breathed it deliberately for a moment, simply the physical fact of being able to take a full breath. A young woman in a gray dress was sitting in a chair near the door with the particular stillness of someone who has been told to wait quietly and has been doing exactly that for an indeterminate period. She stood when she saw Evelyn's eyes open. "You are awake, Miss Ashworth," she said, with the relief of someone who had found the experience of sitting with an unconscious person more alarming than she had been prepared for. "I will let His Grace know." "Please do not," Evelyn said, because every instinct in her said it, which was that the situation was already sufficiently terrible without summoning additional witnesses. But the maid had already opened the door, and there was the sound of a brief, quiet exchange in the corridor. And then the door opened further, and Alexander Vane came through it. He was still in his formal clothes, though the cravat had been loosened, and he had the look of someone who had set aside whatever he was doing, without pausing to arrange himself first. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had been directing at her during their conversation, which she had not expected, because the quality of attention people offered usually changed significantly after they had witnessed someone lose consciousness at their event. His had not changed. If anything, it was more direct, the attention of someone who had assessed the situation and was now arriving at a conclusion. "You are awake," he said. "I am," she said. She sat up, slowly and with care, and the room behaved itself and stayed where it was, which she considered a significant improvement over its previous behavior. "I owe you an apology." "You do not," he said. "I collapsed on you at your own ball," she said. "I believe I do." He crossed the room and sat in the chair the maid had vacated, which placed him at a proper distance, and which also meant that they were conducting this conversation at the kind of distance that was suitable for actual conversation, rather than shouting across a room, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was not the posture of a duke managing a formal situation, and which she found, for reasons she could not immediately account for, more reassuring than formality would have been. "Your mother is in the corridor," he said. "She has been there since you were brought up. I asked her to give us a few minutes before coming in, because I thought you would prefer to be fully alert before receiving her." Evelyn looked at him. "That was very perceptive of you," she said. "She has been quite worried," he said, without judgment in it. Simply information. "She is always worried," Evelyn said. "It is her most consistent quality. It comes from love, but love in her particular form tends to express itself as worry. She has worried about things that never happened, and about things that happened regardless of the worrying. And she has never once been deterred by evidence that worrying is not effective." He received this with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Considerably better than I did," she said. "Embarrassed, to a degree I find difficult to quantify, but physically improved." "Why did you collapse?" he asked. The question was direct and without social softening, asked not to fill space, but because he wanted the actual answer. She considered giving him the easiest version of the truth, which would have been the heat and the crowd and the dancing. All of those things were true. They were simply incomplete. "I have not been eating properly," she said, with the evenness she applied to facts she had decided to stop arguing with. "There have been matters requiring my sustained attention for some time, and eating regularly has not always been manageable during them. Tonight the warmth compounded what was already a difficult situation, and the dress fits quite precisely, which does not assist breathing." She paused. "That is the full account." He received this without the expression she had anticipated, the one people produce when they receive information they find uncomfortable and are deciding how to respond to it. He simply absorbed it the way he appeared to absorb most things, with the focused attention of someone sorting information, rather than managing his reaction to it. "The not eating," he said carefully, "is that a matter of circumstance or of choice?" "Circumstance," she said, without hesitation. It was not a word she would have used with most people. Most people would have heard it as a bid for sympathy, which was the last thing she wanted from anyone, and especially the last thing she wanted from this particular person, in this particular room. He had not asked with the expression of someone preparing to feel sorry for her. He had asked with the expression of someone who wanted the facts before forming a view. "It is a temporary circumstance." "I see," he said. Then, after a deliberate pause, "What were you going to say?" "Before the situation changed, you were in the middle of something." It took her a moment to understand what he meant. Then she understood he was referring to the conversation, to the window, to the specific moment before she had taken her hand from the glass, and the room had tilted sideways. The fact that he had noticed she had been about to say something, the fact that in the middle of everything that had followed, he had held on to that detail. "I was going to say that the conversation was better than I had expected the evening to be," she said, "and then I was going to say something about the window, a reason it might have been left closed, that I had only just thought of." "What reason?" "The flower arrangements are placed close enough to the current that opening the window might catch them. They could have fallen. Whoever arranged them would have been distressed. I thought perhaps whoever closed the window had done it to protect them, without thinking about whether the room needed air." He was very still for a long moment. "That is an extremely specific thing to be thinking about while collapsing," he said. "I did not know I was collapsing," she said. "I thought I was still having a conversation." "You were still having a conversation," he said. "You had simply changed your position for the second half of it." She looked at him steadily. In the warm, quiet light of the lamp, with the night air coming through the window, and the sound of the ball still audible somewhere below them, she felt the peculiar calm that sometimes follows a catastrophe once the immediate danger has passed. Everything was exactly as difficult as it had been before the evening began. Nothing had changed in any material way, and yet she was sitting in this room, having this conversation with this specific person, and something about it had the quality of a door that she had not known was there until it opened. "You stayed," she said. "My housekeeper could have managed everything perfectly well," he said. "She was fully prepared to." "Then why did you?" He considered this, and she appreciated that he considered it rather than answering with whatever came first. "Because you were talking to me," he said. It seemed rude to leave in the middle of a conversation. It was, she thought, the most unusual reason anyone had ever given for anything. It was also the most honest thing he could have said, and honesty of that specific unconscious quality was something she recognized because she worked at it deliberately herself and knew what it cost. "You should know," she said, "that the flowers would have been fine. I recalculated the distance after I said it. The current would not have reached them." He looked at her, and then he smiled, the same smile she had seen briefly in the ballroom, genuine and unguarded, and entirely different from everything else about his face. "I will keep that in mind for future events," he said. They sat in the quiet for a moment, and it was not uncomfortable. She became aware, gradually, that she was sitting in a bed, having a conversation with a man she had met less than 2 hours ago, under circumstances that were going to look a particular way from the outside, regardless of what had actually occurred, and that she should probably address this. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he said, and stood at once. She found her gloves on the side table and put them on. She found her bag. She stood carefully, and her body cooperated entirely, and she straightened the front of her dress. At the door he paused and turned back once. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the full weight of his attention. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I hope you will permit me to say that I very much regret that the evening ended the way it did, and not for the reason you might expect." She looked at him. "What reason, then?" "The conversation was interrupted," he said. "I would have liked to finish it." She held his gaze for a moment. "So would I," she said. Then he was gone, and Margaret came through the door immediately after with the controlled urgency of a woman who has been standing in a corridor for 20 minutes and has used every bit of her considerable self-discipline to wait for this long. She looked at Evelyn with the expression that meant she had been very frightened and was now very relieved, and was going to express neither of these things directly, because they were not alone, and she was still herself. "You look considerably better," she said. "I am considerably better," Evelyn said. "Shall we go?" They went home through the dark in the hired carriage, through the countryside that was invisible beyond the windows, and Margaret held Evelyn's hand for most of the journey, without being asked and without commenting on it. Evelyn watched the darkness outside and let herself be held and did not say very much. She went to bed when they arrived home and lay in the dark listening to the house settle, and she thought about gray eyes and a genuine smile, and the specific and unusual quality of being listened to by someone who was not waiting for you to finish so they could say what they had already decided to say. She thought about this until well past midnight, and when she finally slept, she slept deeply and did not wake until morning. She had been thinking, since the ball, about what it meant to be listened to, not attended to, which was different, and which she had experienced plenty of. People attended to her in social situations because she was Edmund Ashworth's daughter, and because she said things that were worth responding to, and because she could hold a conversation with competence and some ease. She had been attended to all her life. What she was thinking about, lying in the dark with the lamplight gone and the sound of Mrs. Pratt moving quietly through the house below, was something different from being attended to. She was thinking about being heard. The conversation at the window had been brief. 5 minutes, perhaps 6. She had said things she did not normally say at parties. Observations that were specific rather than general, honest rather than flattering, and they had been received not as acceptable social contributions, but as things that were actually true, and that someone had actually heard. The flowers had been arranged with anxiety rather than care. She had said it, and he had looked at them and said yes. Not good point, or how interesting, or the slightly delayed affirmation of someone managing a conversation. He had said yes, and meant it, and moved on. She had been listening to the wrong things, she thought. She had been listening to whether people were interested in her, and whether the interest was genuine, and whether she could trust it, and she had been keeping careful accounts of the results, and the accounts had generally been negative enough that she had stopped looking for exceptions. She had not been listening for someone who listened the way she listened, with the full weight of their attention and no desire to redirect it toward something else. She turned onto her side in the dark and let the thought settle. She had a great deal to do tomorrow. There were letters to write and a meeting with the solicitor next Thursday that needed preparation, and the school fees for the neighbor's daughter, who she had been quietly supplementing because Mrs. Pratt had mentioned it, and Evelyn had felt she should not know, and had quietly done something about it anyway. There were the ordinary problems of a life that needed managing, and she was going to manage them, because that was what she did, and it was what she was good at, and it needed to be done. But she was also going to allow herself to think about what she had heard at the window, and what she had felt in the dark while the room tilted, and the specific and particular quality of a voice that said "you are all right," with the certainty of a person reporting a conclusion, rather than offering comfort. She was not going to decide anything about it tonight. She was simply going to let it be what it was, without reducing it or managing it, or putting it in the same drawer as the things she did not have time for. She was, she thought, perhaps learning something. Sleep came eventually, and it was good sleep, the kind that comes when something that has been held too tightly finally relaxes. She woke in the morning, and the problems were all still there, exactly as they had been, and she was exactly as capable of addressing them as she had ever been. She got up and went downstairs, and asked Mrs. Pratt for breakfast, and ate all of it. The morning after the ball, Evelyn made a decision before she had finished her first cup of tea. She made it at the kitchen table, because the kitchen was warm, and the sitting room fire had not yet been laid, and she made it with the same clean certainty she brought to every decision she was entirely sure about. She was going to behave as though the previous evening had been an unremarkable social occasion. She was going to refer to it, if asked, as pleasant. She was not going to discuss what had happened in the ballroom in any detail, not with anyone, not even Clara. And even with Clara, she was going to exercise careful restraint about what she said and what she revealed. This was not denial. Denial was what happened when you could not face a thing. This was strategy, and strategy was something she was considerably better at than denial. Mrs. Pratt came in with a fresh pot of tea and set it on the table, without remarking on the fact that Evelyn was sitting in the kitchen rather than the dining room, because Mrs. Pratt was a perceptive woman who had long since concluded that people sat where they needed to sit, and that commenting on it served no useful purpose. "Your mother is still in bed," Mrs. Pratt said. "I took her tea and toast at 7, and she thanked me and closed her eyes again." "She was worried last night," Evelyn said. "She was," Mrs. Pratt said, "and so was I." This was the closest Mrs. Pratt had come in 3 years of careful professional distance to saying something personal, and Evelyn received it with the full weight of the gratitude it deserved, because Mrs. Pratt had stayed with them through 4 years of deteriorating circumstances and declining wages, and she had not once made them feel the cost of her loyalty. "I am perfectly fine," Evelyn said. "You need to eat properly," Mrs. Pratt said, and set a plate of bread and butter and a soft-boiled egg in front of her, with the decisive care of someone who had given this same speech many times and expected the usual amount of resistance. Evelyn ate everything on the plate without arguing, because she had decided last night, while lying in the dark, that the argument about eating was one she was going to stop having with herself. It was not an argument she could afford to keep losing. Clara arrived at 10, which meant she had been up since at least 7, composing what she intended to say and rehearsing how she intended to say it. She came in with her usual energy and settled herself at the kitchen table and looked at Evelyn with the sharp, clear eyes of someone who had already formed an opinion and was now confirming the details. "Tell me everything," she said. "I fainted at the ball," Evelyn said. "You collapsed in the arms of the Duke of Ravensmore at the ball," Clara said. "These are materially different sentences. The outcome was the same." The outcome was considerably more interesting than a standard faint. Clara accepted the cup of tea Mrs. Pratt set in front of her with a brief nod of thanks. "Every person at that event has already told 3 other people, by my estimate. My mother had heard it before I left the house. By this afternoon, it will have reached people who were not there, and who have no connection to anyone who was. By tomorrow morning, it will have a version that bears only partial resemblance to what actually happened." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had known this in the abstract way. You know something is going to be true before the evidence arrives. She had been hoping it would be less unpleasant in practice than in anticipation. It was approximately as unpleasant as she had anticipated, which was at least a form of accuracy. "Nothing terrible," Clara said, with the careful precision of someone choosing exactly the right word. "Yet, they are saying you were unwell, and that the Duke caught you and personally saw to your recovery, and that your mother was attended to in the corridor by his man, with specific instructions about your comfort. It is being discussed with the enthusiasm of a very good story, which is what it is." "I am not a story," Evelyn said. "No," Clara said, "but what happened to you was one, and other people do not require your permission to find it interesting." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Evelyn's. "The question is what you do with it, not what other people say about it." Evelyn looked at Clara's hand, and then at the table, and then at the window where the morning light was coming in, at the angle that told her it was nearly 10:30. "There is a card in the hall," Clara said, very quietly. Evelyn looked up at her. "It came this morning," Clara said, "before I arrived. Mrs. Pratt mentioned it when she let me in. She said she left it on the hall table, and was waiting for you to notice it yourself." Evelyn stood and went into the hall. On the small table near the door, next to the bowl where they kept keys and the correspondence that required attention, was a single calling card. It was cream-colored, heavier stock than the usual visiting cards, engraved with a precision that communicated care. She picked it up and turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that was clear and controlled and entirely unsentimental, were 4 words. "I hope you recovered." Nothing else. No title. No social nicety beyond the simple and direct inquiry. 4 words that managed, in their brevity, to say something that a longer message would have diluted. The brevity itself was the message. "I thought about you this morning, and I am not going to make more of that than you want me to make of it." She stood in the hall for a moment, the card in her hand. Then she went back to the kitchen. "He sent a card," she told Clara. Clara said nothing, which was her way of saying a great deal. "I am going to reply," Evelyn said, briefly, "to thank him for his assistance. And then I am going to set the entire evening aside and focus on the actual problem." "The 90 days, Clara said. "The 90 days, Evelyn confirmed. She went to her father's desk that afternoon and sat down with the good writing paper, the paper she kept for correspondence that mattered, and she wrote Alexander Vane a note that was 4 sentences long. She thanked him for his assistance. She expressed regret for any inconvenience caused. She stated that she had fully recovered. She hoped the remainder of the evening had been enjoyable despite the interruption. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied, because the first version was too formal in a way that felt like a rebuff, and the second had slightly too much warmth at the end, and the third was exactly right. She sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Pratt to be delivered, and told herself she was not going to think about it again. She thought about it for most of the afternoon. Margaret emerged from her room at noon looking composed and contained, which told Evelyn precisely nothing about her emotional state, because Margaret had learned to compose herself for audiences, regardless of what was happening behind the composure. She came to the lunch table and they ate together, and Margaret refilled her own tea twice and rearranged the salt cellar 3 times, without appearing to notice she was doing it, and she kept glancing at Evelyn, with an expression that contained an entire conversation she was restraining herself from having. By 2 o'clock, Evelyn could no longer tolerate the restraint. "Whatever you want to say," she said, setting down her fork. "Please say it." Margaret looked at her. She folded her hands on the table, with the deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing. "I only want to say," she began, "that last night was not what I expected it to be." "No," Evelyn said, "it was not. And that the way it departed from my expectations was not, on balance, terrible." "Is that all you want to say?" "No," Margaret admitted. "What I want to say is that I spent 20 minutes in a corridor being terrified about you, and the person who came to tell me you were awake and alert was not his housekeeper and not one of his staff. It was him. He came to the corridor himself and told me you were awake, and asked me to give you a few more minutes." She paused. "He did not have to do that." "No," Evelyn said. "He did not." "And," Margaret said, and then stopped, and when she began again her voice was quieter, and the rehearsed version of it was gone. "I have been watching people at social events for 30 years. I know the difference between a man who is being courteous and a man who is paying attention. Before the collapse happened, before any of it, he was paying attention." She met Evelyn's eyes. "I noticed. I am not inventing it." Evelyn looked at the salt cellar that had been moved 3 times. "I am not saying it means anything certain," Margaret said. "I am saying I noticed, and I want you to notice as well, even if you decide, as you generally do, that noticing something is not the same as acting on it." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a bird landed in the untended roses and began a private investigation of the branches. She watched it until it flew away. "I have noticed," she said finally. "That does not mean I know what to do with it yet." "Yet," Margaret said, quietly. "That is an interesting word." Evelyn picked up her fork and said nothing else, and Margaret said nothing else either, and they finished lunch with the specific companionable silence of 2 women, who have each made their position clear, and are allowing the other one to think. That evening, Evelyn sat at her father's desk and looked at the column of figures she had been staring at for 2 days without making progress, and found that she could see them clearly for the first time in several days. She worked for 2 hours. She made real progress on the accounts, identified 2 places where small economies could be made without visible effect, and wrote 2 letters that had been overdue. She felt, when she finally set down the pen, more like herself than she had felt in some time. She had told herself that morning that she was going to treat the whole thing as unremarkable. She was beginning to understand that this was not a sustainable position. You could not make things smaller by deciding they were small. Things were whatever size they were, and the decision about their size did not belong to you. She turned out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark. She had said yet. She thought about that word for a long time. That evening, she sat at the window in her bedroom for a while, before lighting the lamp, watching the street below settle into the quiet of a weekday evening. A man walked past with a dog. A carriage went by at the far end. Somewhere up the road someone was playing piano, something simple and slow that drifted through the open window along with the summer air. She had been telling herself since morning that she was not going to think about it. She had been thinking about it all day. This was not surprising, and she was not going to pretend it was surprising. She thought about what she actually knew versus what she was adding to what she knew. What she actually knew was this. She had had a conversation with a man at a window. The conversation had been interrupted by her own medical incapacity. He had responded to that incapacity with composure and care. He had stayed. He had sent a card with 4 words on it, and she had replied with 4 sentences. That was what she knew. What she was adding to that was considerably larger, and it was not fair to either of them to treat the additions as facts. She lit the lamp and went back to the desk and opened the account book and worked for 2 hours, and it was good work, focused and clear. The kind of work that pushes everything else to the side while it is happening. She made a calculation. She had been approaching from the wrong angle for a week and suddenly saw the right angle, and she wrote it down. and worked through the implications, and found that the implications were slightly better than she had thought. Progress, she wrote at the bottom of the page, small but real. She looked at those 3 words for a moment. She thought they applied to more things than the account book. She closed the ledger and put it away, and sat at the desk in the lamplight. At the desk her father had sat at while making all his optimistic calculations in all his enthusiastic handwriting, and she thought about what she had said to Clara. She had said that noticing something did not mean it meant anything yet. That word had been in her head since the moment she said it. She had not said it to be clever or to leave something open. She had said it because it was true, because yet was exactly the right word for where she was, not decided, not resolved, not allowed to be what it might be, or forbidden from being it either. Just yet. She turned out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark and tried to sleep and found that sleep was not immediately available, which was not unusual, and she lay quietly in the dark and listened to the house and thought about a voice saying, "You are all right," with the certainty of someone who had assessed the situation and was reporting a conclusion rather than offering comfort. She had believed it because it was said that way, not because someone wanted her to feel better, but because someone had looked at the facts and determined the facts were these. She fell asleep at some point in that thought, and did not know exactly when, which meant the thinking had trailed off into something quieter, and that was the most restful kind of sleep she knew how to have. He arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day that callers generally chose. Evelyn was in the front garden when she heard the knock, not gardening in any productive sense, but standing near the roses and looking at them the way she looked at problems she was not yet sure how to solve. She had been outside for perhaps 10 minutes, long enough to establish that the roses were more overgrown than she had previously appreciated, and that the front path needed attention, and that there was nothing she could do about either of these things in the immediate term, which was the kind of conclusion she had been arriving at about several aspects of her life lately. She heard the knock, then Mrs. Pratt's footsteps crossing the hall, then the sound of the front door opening, and then a voice she recognized without needing to place it, the same way you recognize a piece of music from its first 4 notes, before you have consciously identified what you are hearing. She did not move immediately. She stood with one hand resting on an overgrown stem she had been considering cutting back, and she thought about the fact that she had approximately 30 seconds before Mrs. Pratt either came to find her or made her own decision about what to do with the visitor, and Mrs. Pratt's decisions in situations she found interesting tended to be ones that Evelyn would not have made herself. She released the stem, brushed her hands together, walked back toward the house at a pace that was not hurried, because hurrying would have communicated something she was not prepared to communicate. Mrs. Pratt met her at the kitchen door, with the expression of a woman who has found the situation both professionally manageable and personally very interesting. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmore," she said, with the particular intonation that was entirely neutral and communicated volumes. "He says he was in the area and wished to return something." "Return something," Evelyn said. "A glove," Mrs. Pratt said. "He says a glove was found at the hall after the evening, and he had reason to think it might be yours." Evelyn looked at Mrs. Pratt. Mrs. Pratt looked back with the composed innocence of a woman who had not yet decided whether she believed this story, but had already decided what she was going to do regardless. "Where have you put him?" Evelyn asked. "The sitting room," Mrs. Pratt said. "I have lit the fire." The fire. Mrs. Pratt had lit the fire, which meant Mrs. Pratt had made a decision about this visit that was technically above her station and entirely in keeping with her character. Evelyn decided not to address it. Margaret was not at home. She had gone to call on Lady Petworth, which was a visit that generally took the better part of a morning and sometimes extended into the early afternoon. The house was otherwise quiet, the particular quiet of a Wednesday morning when nothing was planned and nothing was yet demanding attention, a quality of stillness that she had not intended to share with anyone. She went down the hall to the sitting room and opened the door. He was standing near the window that looked onto the street, not the one overlooking the garden, and he turned when she came in with the unhurried attention she had come to expect from him. He was dressed in a dark coat and plain, well-made clothes that communicated money without advertising it, which was a specific and not universal skill. He was holding a glove. It was a left-hand glove. She was quite certain she had not lost any gloves at the ball. She had been wearing both of them when she woke in the private room. She had been wearing both of them when she left, She had put both of them away in their box when she arrived home. She thought about this while looking at the glove. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth." He held out the glove. "I believe this may be yours." She took it and turned it over. The stitching was slightly different from hers. The size was not quite right. She had seen it approximately never before in her life. "Thank you," she said. "Please sit down." He sat. She sat across from him, and Mrs. Pratt appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds with a tea tray, which meant Mrs. Pratt had prepared the tea before she had even been shown in, and had only been waiting for the conversation in the hall to confirm that it would be needed. Evelyn noted this, but did not remark on it. "I notice," she said, when Mrs. Pratt had withdrawn, "that this is not my glove." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It is, however, a fairly plausible pretext for a call." "I thought so as well," he said, without any embarrassment about it. "I considered other options, and decided this was the most efficient." She looked at him steadily. "Why did you need a pretext? You could have called without one." "I could have," he agreed, "but I was not certain the call would be welcome, and I preferred to have the option of retreating without having made the full commitment of a formal call." She poured the tea. She gave him his cup and then poured her own, and sat back. "My mother is not at home," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw her carriage leaving, as mine was arriving." She looked at him. "I was approximately in the area," he said. She thought about the smile in the ballroom that had not been a performance, and about the voice in the private room that had not been performing care. She thought about the calling card with 4 words on the back. She thought about the fact that he had come here with a glove that was not hers, having watched her mother leave, having considered and discarded alternative approaches. "How long have you been in the area?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps an hour," he said. She looked at the window. Outside, the street was ordinary and quiet. A woman walked past with a basket. A dog followed at some distance. The morning went about its business entirely uninterested in what was happening in this room. "You wanted to continue the conversation," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "From the window, at the ball." "From the window," he confirmed. She held her cup and looked at him, and thought about the decision she had made 4 days ago, which was to treat everything as smaller than it was, and about how well that decision had been working, which was not well at all. She thought about the yet she had said at lunch, and had been thinking about ever since. "Why?" she asked. "You are not lacking for conversation. You had a room full of people who very much wanted to speak with you. People who wanted to speak at me," he said, "or to perform speaking with me. The distinction matters." "Yes," she said. "It does. You were doing neither." He turned his cup in his hands, the small gesture of someone choosing words. "I have been to a great many social events in the last 6 years. I cannot recall the last time someone told me that the flowers at one of my own balls had been arranged with technical skill and no joy." "I should not have said that," she said. "I am very glad you did," he said. "It was the first accurate description of those flowers I have ever received." He paused. "It was also not the most interesting thing you said." She looked at him. "You said that things constrained by circumstance sometimes become more themselves when the circumstance changes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about that since Wednesday." "And what have you concluded?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup. "That it is true of more things than flowers," he said. "That it is true of most things worth noticing." The fire that Mrs. Pratt had lit was doing its work, making the sitting room warmer and more hospitable than it would otherwise have been on a mild Wednesday morning, and Evelyn was aware, not for the first time, of how much Mrs. Pratt understood, without being told anything. They talked for 40 minutes. Not 40 minutes of the kind of careful social conversation that Evelyn had spent years practicing, the kind where you spoke and listened and managed the exchange, so that everyone left having learned nothing of real significance about anyone else. They talked about his estate and the particular difficulty of making decisions that affected people you would never personally meet. They talked about what it meant to be responsible for more than yourself. They talked about the difference between managing something and caring about it, which were supposed to be the same thing, and often were not. She told him, without being asked directly, about the roses in the front garden, about how they had been her father's, and about how they had not been tended since he died, not because she did not care about them, but because there was not time, and not money, and some things had to be allowed to make their own choices when you could not make them for them. He listened to this with the attention he gave everything. He did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated, because she did not want condolence. He simply listened, and then said, "They seem to be managing the freedom rather well." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "they are." When he finally stood to leave, the conversation ended naturally, without the slightly forced conclusion that conversations usually reached when they had been going on for longer than the situation technically warranted. They stood in the sitting room together for a moment, neither of them saying anything, and the quiet had the same quality it had always had with him, asking nothing. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Thank you for returning the glove," she said, and handed it back to him. He looked at it in his hand. Then he looked at her, and there was the smallest movement at the corner of his expression that she had come to understand was the closest he came, in most circumstances, to laughing. He put the glove in his coat pocket and said goodbye and left. She went to the window in the sitting room, the one that overlooked the street, and she watched his carriage go. Then she turned away from the window and looked at the room. The fire was burning. The tea was cold. The chair he had been sitting in retained nothing of him except the slight indentation in the cushion. She had been keeping everything at arm's length since the ball, telling herself it was strategy, and telling herself it was sensible, and telling herself that the distance between what something felt like and what it actually was a distance worth maintaining. She had been telling herself this every day, for 4 days. She stood in the sitting room and stopped telling herself this. She did not know yet what she was going to do with what was left once she stopped, but it was there, and it was real, and it was the size it was, rather than the size she had decided it should be, and she was going to have to find a way to work with that. She went to find Mrs. Pratt and thank her for the fire. Mrs. Pratt said "You are welcome," and did not ask any questions, which was, at that precise moment, the most generous thing anyone had done for Evelyn in quite some time. She stayed at the window for a while, after his carriage had turned the corner at the end of the street and was no longer visible. The street returned to its ordinary self, a woman with a basket, 2 children running in the direction of the small park, a cart moving at the pace of something in no particular hurry. She was aware that something had changed in the room behind her, or rather that she had changed in the room, and the room was simply reflecting what it always reflected, which was the person in it. She had come into this sitting room 4 years ago, in the weeks after her father died, and she had stood at roughly this window, and looked at roughly this street, and had felt the specific weight of understanding that the world was not going to stop moving just because something significant had happened in her family. The street had been the same street, the people on it had been doing the same things, and she had stood at the window and made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that announces itself with clarity at the moment it is made, but a quiet one. She had decided to keep going, to keep managing, to put one foot in front of the other through the practical reality of what her family needed, and to deal with the rest of it later. Later had never quite arrived. She had been so busy putting one foot in front of the other that she had not noticed how long it had been since she had looked up to see where she was going. She turned from the window. The sitting room looked the same as it always did, slightly shabby in the way that rooms look when they have been well used, and not as well maintained as they might have been. The furniture that had been beautiful once, still carrying the shape of its original quality, even through the wear. She had grown so accustomed to it that she did not normally see it as beautiful. Today she saw it as both things at once, worn and beautiful, the two not in contradiction. She went to the desk and sat down, and looked at the ledger she had been working on before he arrived. She had been in the middle of a calculation when she heard the knock at the door, and she had set down the pen, thinking she would come back to it in 20 minutes, and she was coming back to it now, 2 hours later. She looked at the numbers. They were the same numbers they had been 2 hours ago, and they were going to need the same work they had always needed, and that work was still available to her, and she was still the person to do it. She picked up the pen. But before she did anything with it, she sat for a moment and thought about what he had said on his way out. The things constrained by circumstance sometimes become more themselves when the circumstance changes. She had said it first, at the window, and he had said he had been thinking about it, and she believed him, because she had been thinking about it as well. She had been constrained by circumstances for 4 years. She had managed the constraints as well as anyone could have managed them, but she had also allowed the constraints to become so complete that she had sometimes forgotten what was constrained. What was under the management, and the pragmatism, and the careful distance? She was beginning to remember. She put the pen to the paper and began to work, and the numbers came clearly and without resistance, and she worked for 2 hours straight, and made more progress than she had made in the previous 2 days combined. Some things, she thought, setting down the pen at last, worked better when you stopped pretending they were the only thing. The story reached Lady Cecily Harlow on a Thursday morning, through a letter from her cousin, and she read it twice over breakfast, with the calm, methodical attention that most people overlooked because they were occupied with noticing how beautiful she was. She was beautiful. She had been told so all her life by people whose opinions she had learned to evaluate for accuracy, and she had concluded that they were correct in this specific instance, and she had further concluded, at an early age, that beauty was not a gift but a tool, and that the difference between a gift and a tool was that a gift required nothing of you, while a tool required you to understand how to use it and when. She had been working on Alexander Vane for 2 years. Not in the obvious way that the other mothers and daughters had attempted and failed. She had been patient and deliberate, and she had positioned herself in his vicinity without appearing to position herself, and she had been making progress, or she had been telling herself she was making progress, which she was now beginning to suspect were not quite the same thing. She set the letter down and looked out the window at the street below. An ordinary young woman from a family in financial difficulty, attending the ball on what was almost certainly a courtesy invitation, had managed in a single evening to have a private conversation with the Duke, to be caught by him in front of several hundred witnesses, to be attended to personally in his own household, and to leave the event as the most discussed person who had been present. None of this was the letter's phrasing. The letter's phrasing was sympathetic and appropriately concerned, but the facts, once you extracted them from the sympathy, said something specific. Cecily took a second cup of tea and began to think. Evelyn did not know any of this on Thursday morning. She was at a morning gathering at the home of Mrs. Edmund Alderton, who was a woman of sharp observations and generous hospitality, and who had spoken with Evelyn at the ball with the specific pleasure of someone who had found a conversation genuinely interesting. The gathering was the kind that announced itself as casual, but was in practice a structured social occasion at which information moved efficiently and positions were established and tested. Evelyn had accepted the invitation because not accepting it would have communicated something she was not prepared to communicate, and because Clara had said she would come, and because Mrs. Alderton was the kind of company that was actually worth having. Clara had arrived first and had spent 15 minutes in conversation with 3 different people before Evelyn arrived, which meant she had already gathered a working picture of the room's current concerns. She communicated this to Evelyn in the efficient shorthand of a long friendship, which required very few actual words and left nothing important out. The ball was still the primary topic. Their attendance at it, and what had happened after their attendance, was a thread running through almost every conversation. The specific details varied depending on who was telling them and to whom, which was how stories worked. But the core was consistent. People were interested. They were not yet unkind, but they were interested in a way that had the potential to become unkind, if the story found a frame that made it more interesting than it currently was. They had been there for 30 minutes when Evelyn felt the change in the room. It was subtle. It was the kind of change you feel before you can describe it. A slight shift in the quality of attention in a space. The way conversations that had been open turned slightly more inward. She looked around with the unhurried assessment she applied to everything, and saw her. Lady Cecily Harlow was tall and dark-haired, and arranged with the specific precision of a woman who understood that first impressions were constructed rather than happened upon. She had entered with 2 companions, and was moving through the room with the ease of someone who had never once in her life questioned whether she belonged in a space, because the question had never been plausible. She was genuinely beautiful, and she knew it with the calm absence of surprise of someone for whom it had always been true. Clara, appearing at Evelyn's elbow with the quiet efficiency she deployed in situations she had identified as requiring proximity, said in a voice designed to travel no further than Evelyn's ear, "Lady Cecily Harlow. She has been pursuing the Duke for 2 years, methodically, from what I understand. She believed it was only a matter of time. And now?" Evelyn said. "And now she is in this room, and so are you," Clara said. "Observe." Cecily Harlow moved through the gathering in a path that was not quite direct, but was not random either, stopping to speak to several people, managing the room the way experienced social operators manage rooms, and she arrived, eventually, at the place where Evelyn was standing, with the inevitability of something that had been decided some minutes ago and was only now becoming visible. She came with a smile that was warm and perfectly pitched. "Miss Ashworth," she said, "I had so hoped to find you here. I heard about your evening at the midsummer ball, of course, and I wanted very much to tell you how sorry I was." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I have fully recovered." "I am so relieved to hear it." Cecily's tone was exactly right, sympathetic without being excessive, concerned without being dramatic. It must have been terrifying. To be unwell so publicly, in an unfamiliar house, without proper support nearby. "I was well looked after," Evelyn said. "Yes, so I understand." Cecily paused, and the pause was brief and deliberate. "His Grace is very attentive to his guests. He always has been. I have known him for some years now, and that quality of care is entirely consistent with the man." She looked at Evelyn directly. "He is quite remarkable, is he not? When he gives someone his attention, you feel it completely." "I would not know him well enough to speak to that," Evelyn said. "No, of course not." Cecily's smile did not change, but something in her eyes did, something very small and very precise. "Under other circumstances you might have had more opportunity. In any case, I am so pleased you have recovered. Please give my warmest regards to your mother." She moved away, back into the room, and was immediately absorbed by another conversation, speaking to the next person with the same warmth and attention she had offered Evelyn, spreading it equitably across the gathering, like something measured out in identical portions. Clara was at Evelyn's side before 30 seconds had passed. "That was a warning," she said, very quietly. "Yes," Evelyn said. "She was telling you that she has history with him and you do not, that she has a claim you cannot match." "I understood what she was telling me," Evelyn said. "I am deciding whether it requires a response." "Does it?" Evelyn thought about this. She thought about the difference between responding and reacting, which was a distinction she had spent 4 years learning. A reaction was what happened to you. A response was something you chose deliberately, after consideration, aimed at a specific outcome. She did not intend to react to Cecily Harlow. "Not today," she said. They stayed another hour, and the gathering moved in its usual currents, and Evelyn was pleasant and present and gave nothing of importance away. She talked with Mrs. Alderton about a novel they had both been reading. She talked with Clara about Clara's younger sister's impending wedding and the extraordinary amount of organization it required. She talked with 2 other women whose names she knew and whose company she found moderate. She watched the room the way she always watched rooms, carefully and without appearing to watch it. That afternoon, a card arrived. It was not the same as the first card, with 4 words on the back. This one had a different message, longer, written in the same clear and controlled hand. "There is a public walk in the Millfield Gardens on Saturday mornings. I intend to take the air there at 10 o'clock if the weather permits. It occurred to me that you might also find the air agreeable at that hour." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time to make sure she had understood it correctly, and was not supplying meaning the words did not actually contain. The words actually contained what she thought they contained. It was an invitation to a public walk, framed carefully as a coincidence that they might both choose to attend, which gave both of them the possibility of treating it as accidental if the other chose not to come. It was an invitation that required very little commitment and allowed complete retreat. She replied the same day, which was almost certainly faster than was advisable. She wrote, "I have found that the Millfield air is particularly agreeable at that hour on Saturday mornings. I expect to be there." She gave it to Mrs. Pratt to deliver, and went back to the desk and found she could not work. She tried for an hour and gave up. She sat at the window instead and watched the light change on the street and thought about Cecily Harlow's smile and the precise message it had delivered, and whether she had been right to ignore it. She had been right to ignore it. Cecily Harlow's 2 years of careful positioning were Cecily Harlow's problem, not hers. She had not taken anything from anyone. She had had a conversation at a window, and then an unfortunate medical episode, and then a series of further conversations that had been honest and specific, and had produced, in her, a feeling she had not had in a very long time, which was the feeling of being genuinely curious about another person. She was not going to apologize for that. She was not going to manage it into something smaller to make it more convenient for someone else. She looked at the untended roses in the front garden and thought about things that became more themselves when the constraints were removed. Saturday was 4 days away. She decided, sitting at the window with the evening coming on, that she was not going to spend all 4 of those days pretending she was not looking forward to it. The Saturday walk in the Millfield Gardens was exactly what it had been described as, a public walk on a fine morning, attended by several other people who were also taking the public air for their own reasons, and the fact that 2 of those people happened to arrive at approximately the same time and to walk together for part of an hour was not, in itself, remarkable. She arrived at 5 minutes before 10 and found him already there, which meant he had arrived early, which meant something she was not going to attach too much certainty to, but which she noted. He fell into step beside her with the ease of someone who had been doing something comfortable rather than meeting a requirement, and they walked in the particular morning light that belonged to this hour on a clear summer day, and the conversation that began between them was different from the conversations before it. The previous conversations had all had a specific circumstance around them. The ball had had the ballroom, the sitting room visit had had the glove pretext, and the fire that Mrs. Pratt had lit. Today there was only the garden and the morning, and no particular circumstance at all, and she found that without the circumstance, the conversation was both easier and more honest. He asked her about the accounts. Not directly, not as a question about figures or timelines, but as a question about her, about what it was like to carry something like that for as long as she had been carrying it. He asked it with the directness he applied to everything, and without the particular careful sympathy that people generally deployed when they were asking about difficult things. The sympathy that contained in it an assumption that you needed to be managed through the topic. She told him, not everything, not the specific numbers, but the shape of it, what it had cost her to manage it for 4 years, not just financially, but in the other ways, that sustained crisis cost a person, the narrowing of attention, the difficulty of planning anything that extended more than 3 months ahead, the specific tiredness of maintaining the appearance of being fine, when being fine was not exactly the situation. He listened without interrupting, and without the expressions people usually made when they were receiving difficult information, the subtle wincing, or the careful nods that communicated that you were saying something they found sad. He listened the way he listened to everything, with full attention and without performance. It must be a relief, he said, when she had finished, to say that to someone. She thought about this. Yes, she said. I did not know it was going to be. Why did you tell me? He asked. She considered this seriously. Because you asked an honest question, she said. And because I have found that honest questions from honest people produce answers that are worth giving. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I appreciate that. They had walked the length of the main path and turned back, and the garden around them was full of ordinary Saturday morning life. Other people walking, children in the distance, birds conducting their usual arguments in the hedgerows. None of it required any particular attention. It was simply the world going on around a conversation, which was the best condition for a conversation. At the end of the walk, where the path returned to the gate, he said, I would like to do this again. Walk in the gardens? She said. Talk, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. So would I. She went home and found her mother in the sitting room, and Margaret looked at her face and said nothing, and the nothing she said contained everything. Evelyn went to the desk and found she could not work, and she did not try to. The rumor had the particular shape of something that had been constructed rather than observed. Clara brought it on a Tuesday, 4 days after the walk in the Millfield Gardens, and she brought it the way she always brought difficult things, which was directly and without the kind of softening that only delayed the impact of what needed to be said. She arrived at 9 in the morning, earlier than she usually called without a specific reason, which meant she had a specific reason. Evelyn opened the door before she had knocked twice, because she had been at the window with her tea and had seen Clara's approach from half a street away and recognized something in the pace of it. Tell me, Evelyn said. I need to come in, Clara said. This is not a doorstep conversation. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had told her about the social fallout from the ball, and where Mrs. Pratt had set breakfasts in front of both of them more times than Evelyn could count, and the symmetry of the location was not lost on either of them. Mrs. Pratt brought tea, and then found reasons to be in the kitchen that were real enough, but also convenient. And Evelyn did not ask her to leave because she had been with them through everything, and she deserved to know things as well. People are saying, Clara said, very carefully, that the collapse at the ball was deliberate. Evelyn was very still. That you had learned beforehand that the Duke was unmarried, and that a woman in distress might attract his attention, and that you chose your position in the room deliberately, and manufactured the situation accordingly. Clara said it plainly, and did not look away. That you had been watching for him, and timed it. The kitchen clock ticked. The fire in the range made its small sounds. Outside, the morning went about its business. Who is saying this? Evelyn asked. It has spread enough that the source is no longer visible from the surface, Clara said. That is always the sign of something that has been circulating for more than a day, but the phrasing has a consistency to it that tells me it started in one place. The same words keep appearing in different mouths. They looked at each other. Lady Cecily Harlow, Evelyn said. I cannot prove it, Clara said. But the timing corresponds exactly to the morning gathering, and Cecily has connections to at least 3 of the people who were repeating the story by Monday evening. Evelyn picked up her cup. She held it without drinking from it, which was what she did when she needed a moment between feeling something and deciding what to do about it. She felt several things at once, with the clarity that tends to arrive in the middle of a serious problem. She felt the cold, specific anger of someone accused of something they did not do. She felt the deeper frustration of someone who understood that an accusation did not need to be true to cause damage, that the question people would ask was not whether it was accurate, but whether it was interesting, and it was interesting, and they would keep telling it regardless of accuracy, because interesting stories have their own momentum. She felt the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting one thing or another for 4 years, and had just been asked to open a new front. What is it doing to my reputation? She asked, specifically and honestly. Clara did not look away. It is doing what these things always do, she said. People who know you are skeptical. People who do not know you are uncertain. People who want to believe it are believing it. And the majority, who have no strong feeling either way, are waiting to see what happens next. And if nothing happens? Silence is generally interpreted as confirmation, Clara said. Evelyn set her cup down on the table. She looked at the wall above Mrs. Pratt's head for a moment, and then she looked at the table, and then she looked at Clara. She thought about her options with the methodical attention she applied to financial problems. She could do nothing, which would confirm the silence. She could respond publicly, which would give the story more life, and suggest it had rattled her, and it would be interpreted as defensiveness, and defensiveness would be interpreted as guilt. She could ask Margaret to speak on her behalf, which Margaret would do badly, because her loyalty would communicate itself as advocacy, and advocacy would look like defense, and defense would look like they had something to defend. She thought about Alexander Vane. She thought about what he would hear, and from whom he would hear it, and when. She had known him for not very long and under unusual circumstances, and she had spoken to him on a small number of occasions, and in that small number of occasions, she had formed a view of him that she trusted. He listened carefully. He formed opinions from evidence rather than from what other people told him the evidence meant. He had very little patience for things that were constructed rather than real. He was going to hear this story. The social network that had carried it to everyone else would carry it to him as well. She could not prevent that. What she could do was make certain that when he heard it, he had already heard from her. She did not want him to act on her behalf. She did not want to become a problem he had to solve. She did not want to be someone he was defending rather than someone he was choosing, but she believed he deserved to hear the truth from her directly, rather than from people who had not been at the window with her when the conversation happened. She went to the desk that afternoon and wrote him a letter. She wrote it in plain, clear language. The language she used when the stakes were high enough that clarity mattered more than elegance. She told him what was being said. She told him the origin she suspected, but could not prove. She told him that she was writing so that he had accurate information and could form his own view, and that she did not require him to act in any way, and that she was managing the situation herself. She sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Pratt. Then she went to find her mother. Margaret had heard the story through Lady Petworth an hour before Clara's arrival, which meant it had reached her from a different direction and in a slightly different form, but with the same essential content. She was in the sitting room when Evelyn found her, sitting in her usual chair and doing absolutely nothing with her hands, which was unusual enough that it communicated her state more clearly than anything she might have said. "It is a lie," Margaret said, when Evelyn came in. "Simply a lie." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it is." "What do we do?" "We wait. For now," Evelyn said. "I have written to him. I have told him what is being said, and where I believe it came from." Margaret looked at her steadily. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You wrote to him directly?" "Yes." "Good," Margaret said simply. She was quiet for another moment. Then, "I want to say something and I want you to hear it without arguing." Evelyn nodded. "This has happened because someone who wanted something became afraid that she would not get it," Margaret said. "That says a great deal about you and nothing about her that is good. What you have done by writing to him directly is the right thing. It gives him the truth, and it trusts him to do something with it. And that trust is not nothing." Evelyn looked at her mother. She thought, not for the first time, that Margaret Ashworth was more observant than she was generally given credit for. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She went back to the desk and tried to work, and could not. The letter reached Ravensmore Hall that afternoon. Alexander read it in the library, once, and then set it on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment, in the specific way he looked at things he was deciding about. Then he sent a brief message to George Hendley. George arrived within the hour, because George had learned over 12 years of friendship that a brief message in this particular tone was worth arriving promptly for. He came into the library and looked at Alexander, and Alexander's hands were very still, which told George everything he needed to know about the degree of feeling that was being managed behind the composure. "Tell me exactly what you have heard," Alexander said. George told him. The full version, including the attribution he had gathered, the phrasing that suggested a single origin, the social path the story had taken from that origin to its current reach. He told it without editorializing, because Alexander did not want editing. He wanted the facts. Alexander listened without interrupting. "She was standing at the window because the glass was cooler and she needed air," he said, when George finished. "She did not choose the position strategically. She chose it because she was becoming unwell, and she was managing that in the only way available to her, which was to find a slightly cooler part of the room and keep standing." "I know," George said. "We had been talking for several minutes before anything happened. She said things about the flowers and the musicians that were specific and accurate, and that she could only have said because she was genuinely paying attention to the room and not watching me." "I know," George said again. "She told me what had caused the collapse. She told me directly, without softening it. She did not ask me to do anything about any of it. She did not position herself to receive any particular response. And she wrote to me today to tell me about this story, specifically so that I would have accurate information and could form my own view, without being dependent on what the social network delivered to me in pieces." He stopped. The library was quiet. "She was trying to protect my ability to make a free choice," he said, "even in this." George looked at him carefully. He had been Alexander's friend for 12 years, and had watched him manage situations that would have flattened other people, and he had watched him do it always, with the same composure, and precision, and specific quality of steadiness, that people misread as indifference. He had watched him for 12 years, and he had never once seen him look at a person the way he looked at the wall when he was talking about Evelyn Ashworth. "What are you going to do?" George asked. Alexander was very quiet for a moment. "I am going to do the right thing," he said, "and I am going to do it where the right people can hear it, so that there is no ambiguity about where I stand." George nodded. "I will need your help with the logistics," Alexander said. "Of course," George said. "And I will need you to arrange for Lady Florence to know I will be at her gathering on Thursday." George almost smiled. "Lady Florence will be delighted," he said. "She will be insufferable about it," Alexander said, "but she will also be effective." They sat in the library as the evening came on, and they talked through what needed to happen, and outside the windows of Ravensmore Hall the summer grounds were quiet and dark, and entirely unaware that a decision had been made in the room above them that was going to matter considerably. The thing about constructed rumors, Evelyn thought the next morning, was that they had a specific texture to them. They felt different from stories that had simply grown in the telling, which tended to be inconsistent in their details, and to have the particular energy of something that had been passed from person to person and changed slightly in each transmission. A constructed rumor was consistent. The words were the same in different mouths because the words had been chosen and given out already shaped. This one had that texture. Clara had noticed it. Evelyn had noticed it when Clara described it. She sat at the desk and thought about Cecily Harlow with the clear-eyed assessment she tried to apply to things she was angry about, because anger without assessment was just noise, and she had never found noise useful. Cecily Harlow had wanted something for 2 years and had not gotten it, and now she believed someone else was getting it, and she had responded by doing what a specific kind of person does when they feel something slipping away. She had not confronted anyone directly, because direct confrontation was risky and required vulnerability, and she was too practiced to be vulnerable. She had done something that looked like nothing, just stories moving through the social network, just observations that weren't quite accusations, just questions that weren't quite questions. Evelyn had to admire the precision of it, even as she found it entirely contemptible. She understood the move. She had seen similar moves made in other contexts, financial ones, where someone who owed a debt tried to manage the perception of the creditor before the creditor could manage them. It was a preemptive action, an attempt to shape the narrative before the subject of the narrative could respond. The letter she had written to Alexander had been her response, and it had been the right one. She had not shaped a counter-narrative. She had simply given him the facts and trusted him to think clearly about them. He was extremely good at thinking clearly about things. She had observed this multiple times now, and it was the quality she trusted most in him. She did not know what he would do with the facts. She had told him explicitly that she did not require him to do anything, but she also knew, in the way she knew things she had observed with enough care to trust, that he was not the kind of person who received accurate information about an unjust situation and decided to leave it alone because addressing it was inconvenient. He was going to do something. She did not know what, and she was not going to allow herself to count on it, but she knew. She went back to the ledger. The afternoon was quiet and productive, and she worked through 3 problems she had been putting off, and completed 2 letters that needed completing, and organized a section of the household accounts that had been disordered since February. Doing work, she had found, was the most reliable remedy for situations in which you were waiting for something you could not control. The work was controllable. The work was there, and it responded to attention, and it made visible progress, and it did not depend on anyone else doing anything. She worked until the light began to go, and then she made tea and sat with it in the kitchen, where Mrs. Pratt was preparing supper, and the smells of the kitchen were the smells of the house she had grown up in, warm and ordinary, and entirely real. Whatever happened with the rumor, and with Cecily Harlow, and with Alexander Vane's response to the letter she had written, this kitchen was still here. This house, however much it was wearing at the edges, was still here. She was still here, capable, and clear-eyed, and in possession of herself. That was not nothing. In fact, she thought, it was a great deal. Lady Florence Vane held her gatherings on Thursday evenings, which she had done without variation for 26 years, and which she intended to continue doing until she was dead or living somewhere without a suitable drawing room, both of which she considered equally improbable in the near future. She was 71 years old, and had the energy of someone a quarter-century younger, and the opinions of someone who had decided, approximately 4 decades ago, that life was too short and too interesting for the kind of careful hedging that most people called tact. She was tactless, and she knew she was tactless, and she had found that the social world continued to invite her to things regardless, partly because of who she was, and partly because people who said exactly what they thought were, whatever else they were, worth being in a room with. She had heard the rumor about Evelyn Ashworth on Monday. She had formed her opinion of it on Monday. She had communicated that opinion to 3 people on Tuesday, having selected those 3 people with care, because Lady Florence understood that the most efficient way to move information through a social network was not to broadcast it yourself, but to plant it in the right places and allow the network to do the work. When Alexander arrived at her house on Thursday evening, she was not surprised to see him. She had expected him. She had, in fact, made specific modifications to her usual guest list for this particular evening. Not dramatically, not in a way that would telegraph her intentions, but with the deliberateness of a woman who understood the value of a well-composed audience. She met him at the door herself, which she did not usually do. "You look like someone who has made a decision," she said. "I have," he said. "Good," she said. "It was about time. Come in." The drawing room was full in the way that Lady Florence's evenings were always full, which was comfortably and without any sense of occasion, because she had told people for 26 years that she did not permit performances in her drawing room, and most of them had eventually believed her. People sat where they chose and talked about what interested them, and the conversation moved in several directions at once, which was the atmosphere Lady Florence had always preferred. Among the people present were Mrs. Edmund Alderton, whose gathering had been the venue for Cecily Harlow's first move. 3 women who were known connectors in the social network, whose function in the evening was to receive accurate information and distribute it, which they would do, because that was what they did, and they were extremely good at it. Lord Edmund Firth, who had been at the ball and had his own interest in the situation. George Hendley, who had arrived early and was standing near the fireplace, with the expression of someone who is entirely calm, because the preparatory anxiety happened yesterday. Cecily Harlow was not present. Lady Florence had considered the invitation and decided against it. What needed to happen tonight was a correction, not a confrontation, and corrections went better without the person being corrected in the room. Alexander moved through the gathering the way he moved through Lady Florence's evenings, with the ease of someone who had been coming here since he was 20, and who was as comfortable in this room as he was anywhere. He spoke to several people, accepted a glass he did not particularly want, and eventually found himself in the center of the room, in the way that conversations naturally migrate toward the most relevant person in a space, when that person makes themselves available. Mrs. Alderton, who had been watching him since he arrived, and who had the directness that was the characteristic quality of people who had stopped performing indifference, said, "I assume you are going to address the rumor." "I am," he said. "Good," she said, "because it is badly constructed and deserves to be addressed before it does any further damage." "On that, we agree entirely," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not call for attention in any obvious way. He began speaking at the volume he used for conversation, and the people nearest him went quiet, the way people go quiet when they realize something worth listening to is being said, and the quiet moved outward from that point in gradual rings, until the room was listening without having been asked to listen. He told them about the evening. He told it not as a duke managing a social situation, but as a man describing something he had directly witnessed, in the specific language of someone who had been present, and who was reporting what he had seen and heard, rather than what others had told him the meaning was. He told them about the conversation at the window. He told them she had been standing there, because the glass was cooler, and she had been warm for some time, and was managing it in the only way the room made available, which was to find the less warm part of it. He told them the conversation had begun because he had made an observation about the windows, and she had responded, and what she had said had been specific and honest, and had nothing to do with watching for him or positioning herself for any purpose. He told them she had made observations about the flowers, and the musician, and a woman near the east entrance who had been avoiding someone, and that all 3 had been accurate, and that accuracy of that kind was only possible in a person who was genuinely paying attention to the room around her, and not watching him. He told them she had been becoming unwell during the conversation, and had not mentioned it. He said this clearly, and without elaboration. Someone who was manufacturing a scene would have used the unwell feeling as the mechanism of the scene, not concealed it as an inconvenience, and kept talking. He told them she had not known who he was when the conversation began. He let the room sit with that. He said, "I asked to speak with her for a few minutes before her mother was shown in. Not because the situation required my personal oversight, but because I wished to continue the conversation, and I knew that the moment her mother arrived, the conversation would become something else. I stayed because I was interested, and I had been interested before anything happened, which is the part that matters." He paused. The room was very quiet. "The story that has been circulating this week," he said, "is not based on any evidence I can recognize as accurate. It is based on an interpretation of events by someone who was not present for the part of those events that preceded the collapse, and therefore does not have the information required to form a reliable interpretation." He said it the way he said things he had thought through completely, and was now simply reporting, without heat and without particular emphasis. He said it, and then stopped, because everything that needed to be said had been said. Mrs. Alderton nodded, with the definitive quality of a woman who has heard what she needed and made up her mind. Several of the women who were connectors looked at each other with the small, specific look of people who have received accurate information from a reliable source and are already thinking about what they are going to do with it. Lord Firth looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then at George Hendley, who gave him the sort of look that communicated a complete sentence without using any words. Lady Florence, from her position near the window, watched her nephew with the expression of someone who is proud of a person without being sentimental about it, which was the only form of pride she permitted herself. One of the women near the fireplace said quietly, "She sounds quite remarkable." "She is," Alexander said. And then he moved the conversation on, because he had said what needed to be said, and saying it again would diminish it. He talked to Lady Florence about the roses in her garden, which were a genuine topic of interest between them, and had been for years. He talked to Mrs. Alderton about the novel she was reading. He was present and composed and entirely normal, which was the right thing to be. Evelyn was not there. She did not hear any of this as it happened. She was at home, at her father's desk, working through the accounts that she had been making slow but real progress on, and she had no reason to think that anything particular was happening across town at Lady Florence Vane's drawing room. Clara arrived at Ashworth House the following morning at 8:30, which was the earliest she had ever arrived without a prior arrangement, and which meant she had something specific to say. Evelyn opened the door before she knocked because she had heard the carriage from upstairs and had come down already. "Tell me," Evelyn said. "I need to come in," Clara said. They sat at the kitchen table with tea, and Clara told her everything. She told her about the gathering, and who had been there, and what Alexander had said, and she told it without embellishment, because embellishment was not necessary. She told it in the clear, careful language she used when the thing she was describing mattered. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She held her cup. She did not drink from it. When Clara finished, the kitchen was quiet. "He told them about the flowers," Evelyn said. "Yes," Clara said. "He remembered what I said about the flowers in the ballroom, and he told them about it to prove that the conversation was real." She stopped. "He told a room full of people something I said privately, because it was the most specific evidence available, that what happened was what it was." Clara said nothing. She waited. Evelyn set her cup down and stood up and went to the window. Outside, the morning garden was still and bright, the roses reaching in their usual unmanaged directions. She had been waiting, she understood now, for something she could not have named before this moment. She had been managing the situation since the morning after the ball, managing it, and standing at arm's length from it, and calling it strategy. And some of it had been strategy, but some of it had also been something else. Something older and more defensive than strategy. She was finished with that. She turned from the window. "I need to go and find him," she said. Clara looked at her, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this specific sentence for some time. "He walks in the Ravensmoor Gardens in the mornings when he is in the country," she said. "He is in the country this week." Evelyn looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I know a great many things," Clara said. "This is one of them. Go. I will manage your mother." Evelyn went to get her coat. She had told herself, sitting at the desk with the accounts open in front of her on Thursday evening, that she was going to spend the evening on the numbers and not on anything else. She had managed it for 2 hours, which was longer than she had expected. The numbers had been cooperative, in the way numbers are cooperative when you give them full attention, and she had found 2 small places where the calculation had been wrong and corrected them, and she had written a letter to a solicitor who had written to her mother 3 weeks ago and who deserved a reply. She had been doing this, doing the work, not thinking about anything else, when Clara's letter arrived the next morning with everything in it. Now she stood at the window, and the garden was quiet and bright, and the roses in it were going wherever they were going, and she thought about a room full of people hearing about flowers she had described in a private conversation. He had told them about the flowers. Out of everything he could have said to that room, he had told them about the flowers, because the flowers were the evidence of what the conversation had actually been. They were the proof that she had been paying attention to the world around her and not watching for him. They were the detail that only someone genuinely present in the conversation could have given, and he had given it to the room because he understood that the detail was more powerful than any assertion. He had been listening, she thought. From the very beginning, he had been listening in the specific way that people rarely listen, not for the information they needed or the gap they could fill, but for what was actually there. He had heard what she said about the flowers, and he had kept it, and when he needed the most accurate evidence available to him, that was what he had. She thought about the 4 years of managing things largely alone. She thought about the work of keeping everything arranged, of presenting the right face to the right people, of not letting anyone see the weight, because the moment you let someone see the weight, they either pitied you or avoided you, and she had preferred to be neither pitied nor avoided. She had been so practiced at carrying things quietly that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually hear what she was saying, rather than what she wanted them to hear. She turned from the window. "I need to go and find him," she said. Clara looked at her, and there was something in Clara's face that was warm and certain and entirely unsurprised. "He walks in the Ravensmoor Gardens in the mornings when he is in the country," she said. "His habits are consistent. He is in the country this week." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "How long have you known he was in the country this week?" "Since Tuesday," Clara said. "I was waiting for you to reach the conclusion I was fairly certain you were going to reach." Evelyn absorbed this. "You could have told me on Tuesday," she said. "I could have," Clara said. "But you needed to get there yourself. That matters." She picked up her cup. "Go. I will manage your mother and make sure she does not follow you in her own carriage." Evelyn went upstairs and found her coat and her better gloves and the hat she wore for occasions she considered worth dressing for. She came back downstairs and found Clara still at the kitchen table, and Clara looked at her and said, "You look ready." "I am ready," Evelyn said. "Then go," Clara said. Evelyn went. She walked to where the carriage waited, and she got in, and as it moved through the morning streets she looked at the familiar landscape of the town she had lived near her entire life, and thought about how different the same view could look when you were going towards something, rather than managing something. The trees were the same trees, the road was the same road, the morning light was the same light it had always been. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not managing anything. She was simply going. The Ravensmoor Gardens were different in the morning than they had been on the night of the ball. At the ball they had been lit and arranged for effect, every path visible, every hedge trimmed to a precise angle, designed to be seen from inside through tall windows. In the morning they were simply themselves, quieter, and considerably less managed-looking than the version she had observed 3 weeks ago. The old trees casting long shadows across the dew-wet grass, the air cool, and carrying the smell of things growing, the birds making the particular noise that birds make in early morning, before the world fills up with other sounds. She had not sent word ahead. This had been Clara's implicit advice, and also her own instinct. Some conversations needed to happen without prior arrangement. Prior arrangement gave people time to compose themselves, and she had spent enough of the last 3 weeks being composed with Alexander Vane to understand that the composed version of a conversation was not the one she needed to have today. The young man at the door of the hall had clearly been told to expect callers, because he showed no surprise at her arrival, and asked her to wait in the entrance hall while he went to find his grace. She stood in the hall and looked up at the ceiling, which was as high as she had remembered from the night she had been conscious enough to remember anything, and she looked at the morning light coming through the tall windows, and she thought about what she had decided to say, and how she intended to say it, and then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was another form of composing herself, and she had just decided to stop doing that. He came through the door at the far end of the hall after 3 minutes, still in the less formal clothes of someone who has been walking in his own gardens and is not expecting company, and he stopped when he saw her, just for a moment, a pause that was brief and specific and communicated something. Then he came forward. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "I heard about Thursday," she said, because there was no point in beginning anywhere else. He stopped a few feet from her. "Clara Whitmore is thorough," he said. "She told me what you said," Evelyn said. "Specifically, she told me about the flowers." He was quiet. "You could have simply said you did not believe the story," she said. "You could have said so privately to anyone who brought it to you, and left it at that. That would have been sufficient. Instead you said it in a room full of people, and you said it with specific evidence, and the evidence you chose was something I said in a private conversation. That was the most accurate evidence available to me," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I have been thinking about since this morning." She looked at him. In the light coming through the hall windows, he looked less like the composed and careful man she had seen at the ball, and less like the deliberate man who had arrived with the wrong glove, and more like someone who was simply present, without the layers that circumstance usually required. She thought she liked this version best of all the versions she had seen. "You did not have to do any of it," she said. "No," he said. "But the alternative was to say nothing while knowing the truth, and I find that alternative unacceptable. Even at personal cost," she said. "Publicly taking a position on something that concerns a woman you have spoken to on 3 occasions." "4," he said. "4," she said. "Even so." He looked at her steadily. The hall was quiet around them, the morning going on outside, the house going on around them. "Yes," he said, "even so." She had come here with a speech prepared, she realized. Not a long one, but a prepared one. She had been going to thank him, briefly and clearly, and tell him that she understood what he had done, and that she was grateful, and that she was going to manage the rest of it herself. She had been going to say this, and then leave, and feel better for having said it. And nothing about that plan had been wrong, except that it was exactly the kind of thing she would have done 2 weeks ago, before she had decided that she was finished treating the most important things as smaller than they were. "Would you walk with me?" she said, "in the garden, if that is where you were going." "I was going that way," he said. They went out through the side door and into the gardens, and the dew was still on the grass, and the birds were still arguing in the hedges, and the air was cool and clean, and entirely different from the air in the ballroom. They walked without any particular destination, which was a kind of walking she rarely did, because she generally walked with a purpose, and the purposelessness of it was strange and unexpectedly pleasant. After a while she said, "I have been telling myself I was managing the situation." He said nothing. He walked beside her and let her continue. "Since the morning after the ball," she said, "I made a decision before breakfast that I was going to treat everything as unremarkable and keep it at a distance and be practical about it. I have been doing that, or I have been trying to do it. I have been calling it strategy." He was quiet. "I think some of it was strategy," she said, "and I think some of it was something else, something older and more defensive. I have been afraid of being wrong about something I wanted very much to be right about, and I have been managing that fear by not fully allowing the thing to be what it is." They had come to the part of the garden where the formal design gave way to something wilder, where the path curved around the edge of a rose garden that had not been managed with complete precision for some time, the roses growing with the easy confidence of plants that have been left to make their own decisions. She stopped walking and looked at them. "I spent a long time," she said, "telling myself that the practical problems were the reason I could not afford to think about anything else. The accounts and the debts and the 90 days. And the practical problems are real. They are still real. But I think I was also using them as a reason not to have to decide about something I was frightened to decide about." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the full quality of his attention, the same attention he had always given her, unhurried and complete. There was something in his face that she had seen only in glimpses before, the thing that lived behind the composure, and it was there now, because he was not managing it for the benefit of a room or a situation. "I have been doing the same thing," he said, "for a long time before I met you, and then after I met you for different reasons." "What reasons?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the roses. 12 years ago," he said, "I inherited a situation that required me to be precise and careful, and to leave very little room for error. I learned to do that. I became good at it. And I also, in the process of becoming good at it, built something that was useful for managing an estate, and less useful for other things. I built walls. I have been very thorough about them." She looked at him. "I have been telling myself," he said, "that the circumstances were wrong. That now was not the right time. That what I was observing in these conversations we have been having was probably not what I thought it was, because things that are what you think they are tend to feel too simple, and this has not felt simple at all." He paused. "What it has felt like is important, and important things are the ones I am most careful with, because I cannot afford to be wrong about them." She understood this entirely. She understood it the way you understand something that has been true about yourself all along, and you have simply not had words for it until someone else found the words first. "You are not wrong about it," she said. He looked at her directly. "You are not wrong," she said again, because she had decided she was going to say things that were true, even when they were frightening to say. He said, very quietly, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the version of honestly that protects you from the possibility of being wrong, but the actual version." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That is why I am asking." She waited. "I would like to know whether you would be willing to let this be something real," he said. "Not managed. Not kept at a distance. Not positioned carefully in case it turns out to be less than what it seems." He looked at her steadily, and she could see that this was costing him, not a great deal but something, which meant it was genuine. "I am not easy to know well," he said. "I have been told that and I believe it. I am precise, and I take a long time to say things, and I forget sometimes that not everyone wants to have the same conversation for 40 minutes. But I am also not interested in something that is not real, and I am not interested in a version of this that is about circumstances rather than about choosing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning she had stood at her father's desk and looked at the invitation on the silver tray. She thought about the decision she had made then, which was not hope and not despair, but something between the two, something steady and clear-eyed. She thought about 3 weeks of conversations, and one very embarrassing medical episode, and a wrong glove, and 40 minutes in a sitting room, and a walk in the Millfield Gardens, and a letter she had written in plain language, because clarity mattered more than elegance, and a room full of people hearing about flowers she had described at a window. She thought about the wild roses in the front garden at Ashworth House, planted with great feeling and not quite enough planning, growing however they chose because no one had the time to shape them. "Yes," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Yes," she said again. "The actual version. Not managed, not careful. I cannot promise I will not try to manage things occasionally, because it is a very strong habit, and I have been doing it for 4 years. But I can promise to tell you when I am doing it. I will tell you when I am building walls," he said. "And I will tell you when you are being precise, at the expense of being clear," she said. "That seems reasonable," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the morning went on around them, the birds and the dew and the old trees, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there was nothing else that needed to be said right away. They walked back toward the hall through the wild rose garden, and he opened the door for her, and she went inside, and they sat in the library and talked for another hour. And this time the conversation was different from all the previous conversations, because neither of them was managing it, or positioning themselves carefully, or leaving room for retreat. It was simply two people talking, which was, she thought, what all the other conversations had been trying to become. She went home in the early afternoon, and found her mother in the sitting room, and Margaret looked at her, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Well?" "We are going to let it be what it is," Evelyn said. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Good," she said when she opened them. "That is good." They had tea, and did not discuss the finances, which had not resolved themselves but had also not grown worse in the last week, and which would be addressed, as they always had been, with the steady attention of someone who dealt with what was real, rather than what was feared. Mr. Grimshaw's deadline was still a real thing. The practical problems were still real, but they were problems she was going to face with the same clear-eyed attention she had always brought to them, and she was going to face them without the additional weight of managing something else into a size it did not want to be. That evening, Clara came for supper, and Evelyn told her everything, and Clara listened with the focused pleasure of someone who had been waiting for exactly this account, and found it was worth waiting for. She asked 2 questions, both of which were good ones, and she said at the end, "I told you he was one of the interesting ones." "You told me nothing of the sort," Evelyn said. "I told you the people who keep others at distance because they cannot find anyone worth talking to are the most interesting ones, once you find the right conversation," Clara said serenely. "That is the same thing." "It is not remotely the same thing," Evelyn said. But she was smiling, and Clara was smiling, and Mrs. Pratt brought more tea without being asked, and the evening settled around them with the ordinary warmth of a household that was not quite all right yet, but was in the process of becoming more itself than it had been in a very long time. Evelyn sat at her father's desk after Clara left, in the quiet of the late evening, with the ghost of old tobacco in the top right drawer, and the sound of the house around her. She did not open the accounts. She did not write any letters. She sat in the dark with one lamp burning and let herself simply be in the room. She had been performing practicality for 4 years. She had done it because it was necessary, and because she was good at it, and because the alternative had felt like something she could not afford. She thought she had been wrong about the alternative. Some things became more themselves when the constraints were removed. She had said it to him at a window, in a conversation she had not known she was having with anyone in particular, and it had turned out to be true about considerably more than flowers. She turned out the lamp. Outside, in the garden, her father's roses were entirely invisible in the dark, but they were there, and they would be there in the morning, reaching in whatever directions they had decided on, exactly as wild and as alive as they had always been.